And I really worry that like the most like the so-called highest levels of philosophy have really like cut themselves off from the masses. This is why I think projects such as yours, or philosophy podcasting in general, public philosophy, is just so important, because I think the culture needs to be reminded of what is good about philosophy, what's fun about it, what's interesting about it.
So welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Pete Mandik. He is Professor of Philosophy at William Paterson University of New Jersey, and his work focuses on philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and cognitive science. His books include, among others, Key Terms in Philosophy of Mind, and This is Philosophy of Mind, an Introduction. He also has a variety of published articles on these topics. You can also check out his YouTube channel at youtube.com/Pete Mandik. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Mandik.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. And let me just add, I've got a bunch of stuff at petemandik.net. So if people want to see papers or comic strips, or link to my own podcast, it's all there at petemandik.net.
Yeah, good point. I should have added that. I'll include a link to that in the description. Anyway, yeah, so great. I read a bunch of your papers, and I want to cover a fair amount of things. So let's see. One that I'll start with was called Supervenience and Neuroscience, and in there, you argue against non-reductive physicalism. So one of the first components of your argument is this principle called FGS, or fine-grained supervenience, according to which if a single entity instantiates two distinct mental properties at some time, it must do so in virtue of instantiating two distinct physical properties at that time. And you argue that this, along with some other things, sparks a sort of regress, a vicious regress for the non-reductive physicalist. So could you briefly talk about how this goes and the problem here?
Yeah, and can I first say a little about like just the biography that led to this paper, because it had a weird kind of hoary. It was a wild ride. In a lot of ways, this is my first paper. It wasn't the first thing to be published, but it was the first of my publications. Is the one I started writing first, and I started it like way back in grad school. And the initial seed was Andy Clark was in my graduate program. This is the 90s, late 90s, Washington University in St. Louis, philosophy, neuroscience, and psychology program. David Chalmers had just left. He was a postdoc in that program at the time. And Chalmers and Clark have this now famous extended mind hypothesis that was really new. They had just published it, and everyone was talking about it. And I hated it. Like I couldn't put my finger on what was bothering me about it. But I had this thought that what would happen if you combine the sort of thing that Chalmers and Clark are talking about when they do their thought experiment about Otto and Inga, and they're trying to argue that the mind can leak out of the head and supervene partially on Otto's notebook. And I was wondering, like, what would happen if you combined that with Searle's Chinese room? Because a lot of earlier discussions about functionalism, some of them at least hover around these Chinese room sorts of arguments, and a very common sort of thing that functionalists will want to say about Searle's Chinese room argument is the system's response, that it's the whole room that instantiates mentality. And I thought, like, well, what if that's true? It's the whole room. There's some kind of like Chinese understanding mind. It takes up the whole room. But what if instead of Searle, it's Clark and Chalmers' Otto? And Otto is like following the rules, but also taking notes and all that. So arguably Otto, like from Clark and Chalmers, Otto's mind is leaking out of his head and spreading out into the contents of the room. And if you combine that with the system's response, it looks like you have two minds. One of them is the Chinese understanding mind that supervenes on the whole room. And the other one is Otto's, which arguably supervenes on the whole room too. And that just seemed weird to me. And I didn't know what to do with it at first. Like this thought experiment I had. And often with these sorts of thought experiments, you need a target. Like, well, who is this a problem for? It took me a while to figure out, like, well, what to plug this into and what to connect it into. As I thought harder about, like, well, what's weird or what's fishy about saying that there's two minds sharing a supervenience space, I looked to just kind of the original formulations of supervenience that you get out of, a lot of this goes back to Donald Davidson. He's the one that arguably is first using the word supervenience to express this idea of the dependence of the mental on the physical without the mental being identical, type identical to the physical. And it seemed to me like just a natural extension of the basic idea of supervenience to have this amendment or appendix that I call fine-grained supervenience. Classical formulations of supervenience are about comparing two different individuals at a time. So if you and I have different mental properties, there must be some physical property in virtue of which we have those mental differences. Or looking at a single individual across two different times. So if I change, at one time I have one mental state or property, and then a different one at some different time, that must be in virtue of some physical difference. So it really looks to be like in the same spirit of those formulations of supervenience to say, like, well, if you're looking at it a single individual at a single time, there's got to be some physical differences that underwrite the mental differences. And there's a very general way of describing supervenience whereby fine-grained supervenience would just fall out of that. You could describe supervenience as the view that any mental differences must obtain in virtue of physical differences. So from there, like, if you state supervenience that way, fine-grained supervenience is just a pretty straightforward instance or instantiation of that general thing. So when I was really found myself in a position of having like an argument or a piece of an argument and looking for a target. And I've always thought of myself as a physicalist, but kind of have oscillated over the years back and forth between whether I was a functionalist or a type identity theorist, where, very often type identity physicalism is seen in opposition to functionalism. There are ways of combining them, but anyway, I saw those as being the choices. And at least at the time, I decided I'm going to go after functionalism and try to make this be part of an argument for type identity theory. Since then, I'm not sure I really want to be like, for other reasons, I'm actually more convinced of functionalism. But at least that's where my head was back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So anyways, now that I've said that, I've forgotten what exactly your question was. Do you mind? Can you restate the question?
Yeah. I mean, it was just about getting clearer on the sort of regress concern.
Oh, the regress concern. Oh, right. So the way I try to set it up in the paper is to say that functionalism, especially the part of most formulations of functionalism build into functionalism that mental states are multiply realizable. So it's kind of built into these formulations of functionalism that uh, a type identity physicalism is false. Um, and so if it's built into functionalism that the admissible realizations of the mental is got to be this wide or open set that would allow like really odd sorts of implementations, like for example blocks Chinese nation, where you've got each member and each person in the Republic of China has a walkie-talkie, and they're all communicating in ways that mirrors the causal relationships between neurons in a brain. That's a very odd kind of proposal for what might suffice to implement a mind. If it's built into functionalism that it's got to allow these sorts of strange implementations, then it would seem to also have to allow the Otto putting Otto in the Chinese room. But then if you put Otto in the Chinese room, you get this violation of fine-grained supervenience. And that seems like a problem. Now, there's a nearby argument that this is the one that you indicated is the regress argument, which after the paper got published, I realized essentially the same argument has been made by other authors prior to me. So you get something like this from Terry Horgan. He's got this paper about super dupervenience. And there's a paper by Michael Lynch. I forgot the title of the Lynch paper, but he makes a similar sort of regress argument. So all these kind of come out around the same time, and I didn't realize I was scooped until it was published. But all three of those arguments, what they try to do is say, like, look, if you really think about supervenience, you dig deep into the idea of supervenience, you get something like all differences have to be such that there's some kind of physical underwriting of those differences. So there's a version of this argument that doesn't even mention the stuff about Otto in the Chinese room. You could just say, this is what Horgan and Lynch do also. You could say, like, well, look, if non-reductivism is true, then there's some difference between the mental and its physical supervenience base. What accounts for that difference? Now, without formulating fine-grained supervenience or something close to it, for Terry Horgan, the close to it is what he calls the super-dupervenience thesis. So it's not just that for Horgan's super-dupervenience, it's not just the case that two entities that differ mentally have to differ physically, or an entity at different times. It's this general sort of thing that says, like, any differences have to be underwritten physically. Which is a little bit stronger than kind of older formulations of supervenience. But then you're just inches away from getting the vicious regress up and running. For any alleged difference between the mental and the physical, there needs to be some further physical fact that accounts for that. But on pain of infinite regress, you need to find what that physical fact is. You need to get to some point where you are basically abandoning non-reductive physicalism. You got to get to some point where the answer to the question is, how does the physical underwrite the mental? Is at some point the mental is identical to the physical. If there's always going to be some kind of difference, there needs to be some further physical fact that accounts for the difference. In some ways, the argument is similar to the third man argument against Platonism, right? So if in the third man argument, you've got something like, if for any fact, there has to be some thing underwriting that fact. So if there's, if it's a fact that you and I both are brunette, then there's some third thing, which is the brunetteness that we have in common. But if that's a third thing, there has to be some difference between us and that third thing, but that's a fact that would need some fourth thing to account for it. And so that's the third man a regress argument against Platonism. So there's a very similar kind of structure to this one, uh, where the analog to Platonism in this case would be non-reductive physicalism. If it's positing these properties that in some sense float free of the physical, um, but also wants to be called physicalism, then there needs to be these additional physical properties that would underwrite this super duper venience uh, thesis, or the fine grain supervenience thesis. That's how the argument's supposed to work.
Yeah. Yeah, good. So, a couple of things. What if someone were to just maybe bite the bullet on the regress and say, yeah, you can, but say it's like benign, maybe. They say, yeah, you pick out some particular mental property, um, or maybe a pair of mental properties. Their distinctness is in virtue of some distinctness in physical properties. Oh, but okay, those mental properties are themselves distinct from the physical property, and that could be explained by some further physical property. And you can always ask this question about how a particular mental property is distinct from some physical property, and it's going to be in virtue of some further one. There's just going to be this infinite chain, if you want to talk about them in this way, of physical properties that explain these distinctness relations.
Yeah, at this point, oh, sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
At this point in the dialectic, I think we get to this point that is just, it's kind of boring. But where we get is that the argument just becomes, well, why call that physicalism? Why isn't what you're describing a kind of dualism? And my imagined opponent, they could say, look, it's kind of physicalism because we've got these other supervenience theses, right? And now it's starting to look like a verbal dispute, which, when philosophy starts to look like a verbal dispute, it gets pretty boring fast. So I think that if someone wanted to bite the bullet that way, there's really nothing much more to say beyond that, except like, why call that physicalism? So not the strongest response, although sometimes that's where we end up.
No, it seems reasonable enough to me. Like, a concern I've had for a long time is that on supervenience physicalism is that, I don't know, on certain ways of formulated, it seems to allow that certain things or certain properties can exist on physicalism, even though they seem quite opposed to what people might think is consistent with physicalism normally construed. So, for example, certain forms of dualism perhaps are consistent with supervenience physicalism. Maybe some necessitating version of dualism. Maybe property dualism, panpsychism or idealism, maybe even certain forms of those might be consistent with supervenience physicalism. And at that point, it seems to me like, why call it a form of physicalism if it's consistent with all these other views that are normally thought to be kind of anti-physicalist?
Right.
Maybe that's my concern, or one.
I think that's a good concern. And I have that concern too. But that's that sort of concern I was expressing a loss of confidence in, just because it just seems like it's a verb. It comes down to a verbal thing. Like, why call it that? But yeah, I agree. So like, there's ways of talking about supervenience whereby, at least on paper, you could come up with a theory that would satisfy that, but also satisfy a whole lot of Cartesian dualism. So, at least I could write down without any obvious contradiction that our minds are non-extended substances. That these non-extended substances don't even have location, but just by some miracle or accident, everything is such that supervenience would be respected. This thing, which is not identical to my body, nonetheless evolves in lockstep along with it. It's just a brute fact that that is the case. Nothing is nothing is making that happen. Um, it you know, you can imagine God just set it up like that, or you could just have an atheistic version where like that's just the way it is. There's no explanation for it. It's just a brute fact that there are these systematic correlations, and you could have the correlations just. It could be something that's just in this possible world, or it could be something that holds across a whole class of possible worlds. You could come up with really strong versions of it. It would not. Now you could do this on paper. Whether you can motivate it, whether it'd be the sort of thing that like someone would arrive at based on the evidence or based on the arguments, that's another thing altogether. But just in terms of like, is this like, if you wanted to bite the bullet and believe in this, would you have contradicted yourself? No, nope. So yeah, I think those kinds of views are possible in the sense that you could cook up an internally consistent view. I don't know what could possibly motivate that or how you would argue positively for it, but I don't think there's much of a knockdown argument against it either, aside from saying like that just doesn't seem like physicalism. It seems like physicalism would need there to be a deeper relationship between the mental and the physical than simply the sort of thing that you would get from parallelism, like old fashioned parallelism, where God just sets up these causally independent streams that just happen to unfold in lockstep.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, but I share your worry there about it potentially being a semantic dispute. And then that can get kind of uninteresting at that point. Yeah, so I did want to move on to another one of your papers. So you also wrote on Frank Jackson's knowledge argument and the possibility of deviant phenomenal knowledge. And yeah, so roughly the idea that with deviant phenomenal knowledge is that something or someone can have phenomenal knowledge, what it's knowledge of what it's like to have experiences of red, for example. We'll come back to this what it's like and stuff later on, I guess. But and that's without ever having any such experience, maybe without ever having experiences at all. Like one way to think about this potential sort of person is like a swamp Mary or a swamp person, perhaps, inspired by Davidson. And anyway, the main idea is that I'm understanding it is that if such deviants are possible, then regular Mary, like in the black and white room pre-release, could in principle deduce facts about phenomenal knowledge from the physical facts because she could deduce them about Swamp Mary. Swamp Mary has that phenomenal knowledge, but also is, at least at that point, has no phenomenal states. And so those could all be physically accessible to her in some way, in the terminology and knowledge that she has in the room, if that makes sense. Is that roughly right, or how would you describe
Yeah,
that's
the gist of it. Just yeah, so just to make sure people know what Swamp Mary is, you've got this basic figure of Swamp Man, which I only recently discovered Ruth Millikan came up with that before Davidson. Like there's a publication from like a year prior to Davidson. David, like she doesn't call it Swamp Man or Swamp Person. I forgot what she calls it, but for some reason Davidson is the one that's associated with this, although Millikan scooped him by a year. Anyway, so a swamp person is someone who just by some accident pops into being. They are similar to some pre-existing being, right? So like Swamp Pete would be just like me. Just by some weird quantum accident, suddenly I have a perfect copy. Unlike me, I'm actually 52 years old, I presume. This thing just popped into existence a minute ago, so it's only a minute old. But intrinsically, like down to the molecule, everything is in Swamp Pete is in the same place doing the same things as in Pete. And a lot of people have the intuition that Swamp Pete, to a large degree, if not totally, at least to a large degree, is going to have some of the same mental properties that I have. So if I believe that I once celebrated a birthday at a trampoline park, Swamp Pete believes of itself that it once celebrated its birthday at a trampoline park. It just popped into existence a minute ago. Its belief is false. My belief is true. So there's that difference. But a lot of times the way we think about mental differences, it's the differences independent of truth and falsity. It's more like just, well, what's the content of the belief? Is it a belief that snow is white, or is it a belief that grass is green, or is it a belief that you once celebrated a birthday at a trampoline park? So relative to at least some beliefs, Swamp Pete is going to share beliefs with me. Swamp Pete might also share experiences with me. So if you drop a cinder block on my foot, I'm gonna swear, and I'm gonna cry. Tears will flow, and the same thing will happen to Swamp Pete. Swamp Pete is causally, internally, just like me. So whatever behaviors dropping a cinder block on my foot will engender in me, you'll get the same behaviors out of Swamp Pete. Presumably, what's happening in between the stimulus and the behavior involves some mentality, an experience of pain, a painful experience. And I think a lot of people have the intuition that Swamp Pete would also be in pain. So it looks like you get a lot of mentality from Swamp Pete. So now let's do Swamp Mary. Swamp Mary is a swamp twin of post-release Mary. So after Mary has seen red, and now all or just about all parties to the Mary debates will grant that after she sees red, Mary now knows what it's like to see red. The big questions are about whether she knows it before that, but everyone will grant that she knows it after that. So this swamp thing just popped into existence a second ago. It's intrinsically just like post-release Mary. Mary knows what it's like to see red. How does she get that knowledge? Probably it had something to do with her having seen red, the real post-release Mary. Swamp Mary hasn't seen red. We're stipulating she hasn't seen red, but she's in the same state Mary is in when Mary knows what it's like to see red. One thing that's worth adding to kind of help make this more clearly conceivable is that very often you can have a piece of knowledge about an experience without having the experience of the sort that the knowledge is about. And something like this is just a general feature of knowledge. So when you learn something, unless you forget it, you have it. You have that knowledge, and oftentimes you have that knowledge over a long stretch of time, and that includes stretches in which you're completely unconscious because you're under a general anesthetic and going in for surgery, or you're in a deep and dreamless sleep or something like that. So you can know, for example, what it's like to see red, even, maybe that's something that you learned years and years ago and it stays with you, and you still have that knowledge even when you're not activating it or using that knowledge. It's still there. So we can imagine that Swamp Mary is identical like to a post-release Mary who's taking a nap, or a post-release Mary who's under a general anesthetic, or a post-release Mary who is experiencing only green, right? She knows what it's like to see red. She currently is not experiencing red. She's experiencing green, and she, is able to know, for example, what it's like to see red is not that green. It's green. So there's lots of ways in which we can get ourselves to appreciate that Swamp Mary can know what it's like to see red, even though she has never, ever seen red and is not currently having a red experience. She might be currently not having a red experience because she's currently not having any experiences, because she's like in a in a temporary coma or under a general anesthetic or something like that. So I just, the listeners should know like exactly what they're supposed to be imagining when they're imagining Swamp Mary. She's someone who has phenomenal knowledge. Specifically, she knows what it's like to see red. She has never, ever, ever yet experienced red. And so then the next stage in the thought experiment is what can Mary get out of that? Like, what if Mary had access? So what if pre-release Mary had access to Swamp Mary? Fully black and white mediated access. So she's using video cameras and maybe robotic drone arms, and maybe she's even allowed to do a little bit of surgery or run scans or whatever. I mean, it's a thought experiment. The sky's the limit. But she is, the rules are we don't let Mary have a red experience. We let her have black and white and shades of gray epistemic access to the physical facts about Swamp Mary. What can we get out of that? And then I try to string it together into an argument whereby it looks like Mary would be able to deduce then what it's like to see red, because she has access to knowledge. She has access to Swamp Mary's knowledge.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I don't know how much of this is going to turn on how we're thinking about what the content of that sort of phenomenal knowledge would be. What is this? What is likeness that, like, say, Swamp Mary would have? That
I think
Mary would be able to deduce. Sorry,
yeah, so I mean, I think that's a really good question in general to ask about this stuff. Like, well, what is the nature of the knowledge? Like, if you're going to tell me what I ultimately think, this is the position I now hold. This paper was published many, many years ago. My position right now is that I don't think Mary would learn anything new. And I have a very specific proposals for what phenomenal knowledge is, such that Mary can have it in advance. At the time of this Swamp Mary's Revenge paper, I thought I could set, and I mean, I think in theory this is correct too, that the Swamp Mary's Revenge argument doesn't depend on any view whatsoever of what the content of phenomenal knowledge is. That it's just it's trying to point out that if Swamp Mary has phenomenal knowledge, then from the existence of Swamp Mary, it follows then that there's this phenomenal knowledge. And if there's this phenomenal knowledge, it has to be physical. And then you just connect the dots in kind of a hypothetical syllogism that the phenomenal knowledge is physical. I must confess that I'm not super comfortable with this argument. I have a reaction to this argument that seems to be somewhat universal. Like, people I've presented this argument to, the reaction is something like, this is just seems too easy. This can't work. There isn't any agreement on exactly what the problem with the argument is. My suspicion is that a lot of the way in which the knowledge argument gets discussed is in terms of deduction, like what it means to deduce, for example, one proposition from some other propositions. And and you might think that in order to really get into what deduction needs to be in this thought experiment, you need some kind of logical apparatus that is, something that would be an intentional with an S logic. Like, you need to dig deep into non-extensional entailment. Like what gets called strict entailment in like modal logics, right? The way I try to set the argument up in that paper is strictly using purely extensional first order propositional logic. So the connectives in when I formalize the argument, it's just material conditionals. So yeah, so in a sense, you're dealing with entailment. P, if P, therefore Q. But it's not like strict entailment in the sense that you would need a modal logic for. It's only entailment in this extensional uh, sense, whereby P entails Q just means it's not the case that P and not Q, right? So um, yeah, the argument I don't think is very convincing. There's some there's something funny about the argument, um, and no one has really been able to agree on what's funny about it. My suspicion, though, is that there's something a little funny about calling that deduction, an inference that you could state strictly in terms of material conditionals, might not be capturing what people have in mind when they're talking about what Mary can and cannot deduce.
Yeah. So I guess the question then would be that whether those conditionals are something that, like, say the first conditional P entails Q, that she could in some way infer Q in some stronger sense, maybe, that you're talking about. Um, it's like something that she can infer just based on the descriptions she has at her disposal, or something like that.
Right, and in
Um,
order to give what I don't supply in that paper, in order to give that further detail, whereby it's um, more like strictly entails, I think you would have to, especially if you want to make this convincing, you would have to dig deeper into it and give some kind of plausible story about what the content. What are the content of Mary's states at these various points of her, like, examining Swamp Mary, formulating theories about Swamp Mary? You've got to tell some story there. And once you like get into the nuts and bolts of, like, well, how could you pull that off? You're now in just a much more interesting terrain in the argument that you're trying to shore up. Kind of, who cares? We don't need that argument anymore. Once you can tell some kind of plausible story about what Mary can know ahead of time. Um, so what I've been much more attracted to in recent years with respect to Mary type arguments is um, is to really try to think through what concepts would be, if you want to be a physicalist in the face of the Mary argument. One very attractive route for a lot of physicalists has been the phenomenal concept strategy, to try to say that, look, there's a conceptual dualism that we can explain without positing a correlated metaphysical dualism. So the mental just is a special case of the physical. There's no dualism on the metaphysical side of things, but there's a dualism on the conceptual side of things. Um, and and part of what the phenomenal concepts strategy is trying to say is that, well, yeah, in some sense, Mary does gain new knowledge um, post release. Uh, what I've been more attracted to is to try to build up a kind of physicalism that's an alternative to the phenomenal concept strategy, because I think really um, probably concepts don't work that way. A lot of the phenomenal concept strategy is kind of stipulating a bunch of facts about concepts, which would it would be great for the purposes of the Mary argument, and if you wanted to be a physicalist, it would be great if concepts work that way. But overall, I think it's just been very ad hoc. That I don't think there's any independent reason for thinking the concepts actually work the way that phenomenal concepts strategists would need them to work. So I've been very attracted to the view then that there's really no there um, when it comes to the Mary argument. There's nothing that Mary's missing out on. Um, she can she can know it ahead of time. But in order to make that case, which I haven't really pursued very deeply yet in publication, I think you need to make a case about what is the nature of what is the nature of experience uh, relative to things like knowledge or information bearing states, Um, wh- what like what theories would have to be true in order to validate the intuition certain people have about um, the knowledge argument? So I think a lot of the again, now I'm kind of abandoning the paper that you wanted to ask about and talking about my current thoughts about Mary. But I suspect like a lot of the intuitions people have about Mary presuppose like this basic kind of Humean view of the mind, whereby there's a distinction between simple ideas and complex ideas. Simple ideas are like atomic ideas and foundational ideas. Complex ideas are made out of the simple ideas. Um, so, like my idea of the American flag is a complex idea that you could explain to me what it's like to look at the American flag, even though I've never seen it before. So I can know that by description. Um, but a lot of people have the intuition that you couldn't know red by description. It would seem to follow then that unlike my idea of the American flag, that the idea of red is itself simple. It so since it's simple, it doesn't have any parts for the different parts of a description to attach to or correspond to, and so then because it's simple, then the only way you can know it, the only way you can know what it's like to see red is if you are acquainted to the red experience itself. So I've been attracted to is to go after that atomism. I think a good case can be made that nothing is atomic when it comes to ideas or concepts or whatever you want to call the furniture of the mind. That Humean picture of there's the complex and then there's the simple is mistaken. It's all complex. That what 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 it is to be read, or what it is to be a red experience, is to be this item in this network of differences and similarities. And so the right way to think about red is the way we already think about the American flag, or the way that we think about Hume's missing shade of blue. Um, and so you can set up a version of the Mary experiment where she's never experienced red, but she's had lots of other experiences that red is related to in a non-atomic, holistic sort of way, that would suffice for her to have knowledge of this thing that, strictly speaking, she hasn't experienced. So one way to kind of make this point is to say that a lot of our intuitions about, say, the simplicity of red come from certain kind of naive or folk theories that we have about color, most of which come to us in childhood when we learn things about color mixing, right? So, like your basic kind of color mixing concepts that you have as a little kid is like red's one of the primaries. You can make like purple out of red and blue, but you're not going to be able to make red out of anything. And so I think a lot of people carry that with them, and their intuitions about the simplicity of red is based on that very basic kind of theory, a theory that arguably is wrong. Um, there's other color mixing schemes. Like one way to do color mixing is in a color scheme whereby you're treating magenta and yellow as primaries, and red is a secondary that you can mix out of magenta and yellow. So instead of Mary in a black and white room, how about Mary in a magenta and yellow room? She's never seen red before, but is she in a position to know what it's like to see red prior to experiencing it? Based on the fact that she's had experiences. I've not seen a version of the Mary argument where like we're supposed to imagine a creature that has no experiences whatsoever, right? She's had experiences in the original version. She's experienced black and white, shades of gray. In this new version, she's experiencing shades of magenta and shades of yellow, and a bunch of color mixing theory. And she gets all of this color theory, and she gets to have all these experiences. She just, we stipulate, hasn't experienced red. Now we have to ask the question, could she know what red is like ahead of time? And there, I think it's plausibly the answer is yes, that we have something very similar to the Hume's missing shade of blue. You've seen all these different shades of blue before, some like lighter than the missing shade, some darker than the missing shade. When you finally do see the missing shade, do you learn anything new? Or do you say, oh, there it is. I've been looking for you, you missing shade. Now I know that I know that I found you. I can see that you're exactly in between all these other shades that I have seen before. So I think that's the direction that the consciousness studies needs to go in vis-a-vis Mary, is to really get into stuff like what is experience, like what are the going theories and of what experiences are. um, I mean, just from the armchair, maybe red is simple. But if we're, I like to think of myself as a naturalistic philosopher, where science has a lot to say and what we should say about this stuff. What's the empirical case relative to the question of whether there are any ideas that are simple, or whether red is simple? And I think the case is actually quite weak there for the simplicity that you would need to get these sorts of arguments off the ground. So I think that's the direction that we need to go in, is to dig deeper into theories about the content experience, and also like digging deeper into what it's like. Like, there's been a lot of really interesting work in the past decade or two of different people trying to analyze what it's like talk, trying to make progress on like whether it amounts to anything that you could really use as a plank in an argument for a metaphysical theory, or whether it's just a kind of benign sort of knowledge. Knowing what it's like is just old-fashioned propositional knowledge. There's nothing special about that phraseology that would lift you up into these strong metaphysical claims about, say, the non-reducibility of qualia.
Yeah, great. A lot of good stuff. I did want to touch on a couple things there. One, on this, like the primitiveness of red. It seems like a strange leap that someone might make, that, well, suppose, I mean, even grant the claim that about the color mixing, that red is sort of primitive in that sense. Okay, why would that entail that our concept of the color red, or red experience, is similarly primitive in some way? It doesn't seem like that would follow, right?
The fact that color mixing, yeah, I mean, I bring up the color mixing just to try to figure out where people might be getting these intuitions from. So people are having these intuitions about Mary that would seem to me like would only be true. Those intuitions would only be true. For example, the intuition that Mary must learn something new, that no amount of description suffices for Mary to know what it's like to see red. I think that red would need to be simple in order for that to be true. If red was complex, the way Hume's missing shade of blue, like our idea of that seems pretty obviously to be a complex idea. Well, if red is similarly complex, then you can have knowledge of the complex, even though you've never experienced the instantiation of the complex. You've only had experiences of the individual elements that are the relative simples of that complex. So, I mean, part of the reason why I bring up color mixing is just to try to figure out like where people might be getting these intuitions from in the first place. Like, why would people be led? Like, why do people believe that you have to have seen red? Why do people believe that Mary can't know it? It can't be the case that there's been a bunch of Marys. Like, people have there's a population of Marys, and we've interviewed them, and most of the Marys, like, no, it's just, it's not based on that. It's got to be based on something else. People aren't born articulating the Mary argument or the Mary intuition. It's not like newborn babies come out and say, aha, now I know what it's like to see red, right? I don't think newborn babies know what it's like to see red. I'm pretty sure newborn babies can see red, but knowing what it's like seems to be a bit more sophisticated. Um, but what is that sophistication consist in? How does one acquire it? What goes into it? And how might it go wrong? So, part of what I'm trying to do is, in a sort of neutral way, set up a debunking argument, like really question the these intuitions. A lot of this is held aloft by intuitions, and if the intuitions were true, then the argument would go through. But are they true? What what's the source of our confidence in those intuitions? The mere fact that we have those intuitions seems not to be enough, especially given how much disagreement there is between people. Uh, Also, like how much education someone needs to be able to really enter into this debate. You know, um, you could get people, into Mary with just a little bit of philosophy, but to really be able to sustain various positions in the dialectic, you need a lot more than that. Um, anyway, I'm rambling. I should stop there.
Yeah, no, it's all good. I did want to add another thing. I mean, you were talking about how in all the kind of versions of the Mary's room thought experiment, she's had some experiences. I mean, about being in a black and white room and so on. But maybe that's still inessential. Like, what if we had this version where she doesn't have any experiences, never had any experiences, but so long as that's consistent with having the relevant physical knowledge, isn't that enough to get the argument off the ground? I mean, couldn't you imagine some maybe sophisticated computer that would count as having the relevant physical knowledge? It should be able to perform the deduction and so on, even if it doesn't have and has never had any experiences. I mean, what do you think about that version?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I've flirted with it a little bit. I haven't given it a whole bunch of thought, but one of the problems that pops up, at least when I've tried to like flesh this out in my own mind, is you really try to make the case that this thing doesn't have any experiences. And of course, it depends on what you mean by experience. One way of thinking about experiences is in kind of a like fairly neutral and functionalistic way of thinking about experiences, whereby they are these states that are, if we think about the states of a system such as this imagined computer system, we could draw distinctions between the input states and the output states, and the intermediary states, the states that are neither inputs nor outputs, but are the in-between states. And we could also talk about states that a system is in for just a very brief amount of time, versus states that take up a relatively long time of its biography. So, for example, in most instances of knowledge, like the sorts of examples of knowledge that a psychologist would call like semantic memory, or other examples would be episodic memory. Those kinds of memories typically last a pretty long time, and the correlative state of knowledge, like you learn a piece of knowledge and then you have that piece of knowledge for perhaps years. But so what are like relative to that kind of way of describing systems and potentially mental systems, what are experiences? Experiences look, in most instances, they take a pretty small amount of time. They seem to be more associated with inputs than outputs. Prototypical examples of experiences are like sensory experiences, like seeing red. That seems like an input, more of an input sort of thing than, say, intentionally raising my hand, which is more of an output sort of thing. That's more about the will than about experience. So back to this hypothetical computer system, if it's gonna apply to the Mary argument at all, it's going to have something like beliefs or judgments. It's going to have something that could be the knowledge, presumably it can have some states of knowledge. Um, and further, it's going to have inputs. It's if this thing is going to have anything at all worth calling empirical knowledge, it's got to have some sort of inputs or other. Why wouldn't those input states be experiences? Now, I said it depends on what you mean by experiences. One thing that you might mean by experiences is something like, well, they have to be conscious or they have to be phenomenally conscious. And maybe we could set up some kind of description of this computer system whereby it has inputs, but they are not phenomenal or they aren't conscious. They're, but anyway, the main point here is that the main difficulty that I've encountered in trying to put this together is to like really make the case that it doesn't have experiences. If it has thoughts at all, it seems like at least some of those thoughts might themselves be more input oriented. Some of those thoughts might themselves count as experiences. It's kind of hard to, I mean, I know we could write down, this thing has no experiences, right? But to like really imagine that and flesh it out is harder to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's something worth thinking about, I guess. But
A
I
second,
see some of the problems
a
there.
second problem is even if you could get there, that you could give some kind of convincing case for this thing lacking experience. Based on the other stuff I was saying, it might be like pretty easy for it to figure out what experiences are, based on what I was saying about like, well, what the similarities and differences are between experiences and these other sorts of mental states like thoughts or episodic or semantic memory. Experiences might be similar enough to that stuff that this system could kind of bootstrap its way into an understanding of what experiences are.
Right. Right. And one more thing related to some of those things you already said here before moving on to something else is you mentioned some concerns with the phenomenal concept strategy. And just on that, I was thinking, I think Papano might be sympathetic to this, which is that maybe the main idea behind phenomenal concepts needn't involve like concepts or concept talk at all. Basically, the idea is that we have at the very least different sets of vocabulary, and it turns out that a variety of statements that we might make using one of those vocabularies, we end up talking about the same thing that we are when we're using the other set. I don't need to make reference to there being these two distinct concepts that have the same thing, their extension or anything like that. It's just that we have this different, maybe this mental vocabulary, this physical vocabulary, and we do, or in principle might refer to the same thing with one vocabulary as we do with the other, if that makes sense. I think that's getting at the main idea behind phenomenal concepts without concepts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you just don't mention concepts, and now we've got something that you could call like the different word strategy. That there's these different words, and but now it still has to. You still need something that. My understanding of the basic strategy is they're trying to hold on to and vindicate this intuition, which I reject. But they have this intuition that Mary must learn something new. In some sense of learn, Mary learned something new when she had after having her red experience for the first time. So if we're going to do like a different words kind of strategy for vindicating that intuition, you have something that looks analogous to, for example, the difference between indexical and non-indexical words, or demonstrative and non-demonstrative words. So prior to my ever setting foot in Paris, France, there's all sorts of things or ways of talking that I'm licensed to use, like third personal non-demonstrative, non-indexical. I could say things like the Eiffel Tower is closer to this building, or the Eiffel Tower is closer to such and such building than this other uh, building. But what I can't do until I set foot in Paris is um, say, I mean, I could utter the words, but I don't really get to say and express a truth with phrases like, the Eiffel Tower is here. Um, or I am standing next to the Eiffel Tower. Though those sorts of locutions, I'm only licensed to perform those speech acts if I'm in France. Prior to entering into France, I can't do that. Okay, so now the question rises: could phenomenal learning be like that? And it's really hard to sustain the intuition that Mary's going to have an aha moment. Like, I think a lot of people that have the Mary intuition, the intuition that Mary learned something new, think that there's going to be some kind of like revelation, like, whoa, aha, there it is. Now I know. I didn't know before. But like, if you think through the Paris example in terms of demonstrative and indexical words, when someone gets to Paris for the first time and now is licensed to say the Eiffel Tower is here, is that learning? Like, are you going to have an aha moment? Like, aha, there it is. Like, I didn't really know where the Eiffel Tower was, but now I do. No, like, someone could know fully well where the Eiffel Tower is before going to Paris. They could have like super detailed knowledge down to the last square inch of where the Eiffel Tower is. And the mere fact that now they're allowed to say, I'm here, standing right next to the Eiffel Tower, that's not going to come with a feeling of aha, or now I get it. So I think the intuition that people are having when they have that Mary intuition is the intuition of something much stronger, much more intimate. That's really hard to see how these mere facts about words, that the conditions under which you're entitled to use such, or perform such and such speech act, that doesn't really seem to be what the intuition is about. It doesn't really seem to satisfy that hunch.
Yeah, I guess I'm fine with that because not really. I don't really have the intuition that Mary's going to have some aha moment or something like that. She really learned something new. So I would grant that she obviously that she has an experience that she didn't have before, and maybe she comes to used terminology or think about that experience in a way that she didn't think about it before. She might use the word red or whatever to talk about some aspect of her experience when that was not a description that she used in her, physical understanding of the world, and including those same states or experiences. So I don't think either of those things involve some aha moment or some learning, I guess, of something new, unless you're counting understanding how else she might refer to the same thing as learning something new. I don't know.
But it,
not
it
very
sounds
much
like
learning. Yeah.
But as I'm hearing you say that stuff, it sounds like maybe you would be comfortable on the dark side, where the dark side is where I live, and where Keith Frankish, and um, so part of what I was hearing from you initially was some kind of attempt to defend the phenomenal concept strategy, but it sounds like where you're going now kind of sounds like you're abandoning the phenomenal concept strategy. And one way to think about the phenomenal concept strategy is that they're attempting to be physicalists while at the same time having a somewhat conservative response to the Mary argument, and in pretty much the same swoop also have a response to the explanatory gap argument. So one way of thinking about the phenomenal concept strategy is it's that whole package. So what you're saying about, like, well, there's maybe these different ways of speaking that Mary would not be allowed to use or able to use. Um, I don't see that really helping the phenomenal concept strategy much, because I'm not seeing how, number one, it retains this kind of conservative response to the Mary argument. But additionally, I don't really see what you're going to get relative to the explanatory gap argument either.
Yeah. I guess the main thing I had in mind for kind of associating this with phenomenal concepts was that it maintains that there is, maybe some conceptual or epistemic or terminological gap, but not a ontological or metaphysical one. And if you want to say that this basic sort of strategy requires more than that, a certain response to Mary's room, okay, then I guess it's not that same strategy that you have in mind. But I don't know. That doesn't seem so important to me. I just think this approach I have in mind seems somewhat sensible. I don't know.
So you don't think? I mean, at least the version of you that's flirting with this. So you don't think Mary is learning anything new, right?
Well,
When she
I mean, it
sees
depends
red for the
on.
first time.
I mean, she's learned that she's seen red for the first time. I don't know. It's not, but like some trivial things that she may learn, but it's like because new things happen that she didn't know about before. I guess.
Well, I mean, specifically with respect to what it's
Yeah.
like. So do you think that? Do you think there is such a thing as knowing what it's like? Do you think that Mary could know what it's like to see red prior to seeing red? Those are the big
Well,
questions.
it's going to turn on how we're thinking about knowing what it's like. And actually, that was something that I did want to cover in related to one of your other articles, and I had some of my thoughts. So maybe I'll save that for
Great.
that, and we can move
Okay.
on to that now. Which article was that?
That might have been Meta-illusionism and Quietism.
Yeah, I assume that's it. So yeah, that was the title of the paper: Meta-illusionism and Quietism. And I took from that one of your primary concerns is that what people are, I mean, typically philosophers, maybe not the folk, if you want to use terminology, are saying when they talk about phenomenal properties or what its likeness and other interdefined or related expressions, it's not quite clear what they're even saying. And so, yeah, sort of to segue from the previous discussion, for me, when I think of knowing what it's like, I mean, one sense of that expression that makes sense to me is that, well, I'm able to recognize which, under which mental categories some experience falls. I have these terms for various sort of mental states and or aspects of mental states, and I'm able to recognize which of those particular experience falls or are applicable to a particular experience. And being able to recognize those things is just that is what it's like, knowing what it's like. There's nothing more to it than that. Now that's some sense of it's sort of knowing what it's like. If that's just what we mean by it, being able to recognize those sorts of facts, that makes sense to me, and I think we can have that. Maybe there's some other sense of, I mean, in discussions with people, and some, albeit not extensive knowledge of the literature on this, a lot of people want to think of what its likeness as something non-propositional or almost indefinable or magical or something. I don't know. Like I don't know how to think about it. I don't really know how to understand that. And maybe I have some of your concerns about not being clear on what that even means. But I don't know. Maybe you want to jump in at some point.
Yeah, so I think what it's like is a very interesting phrase, and there's been a lot of interesting work in recent decades trying to analyze that phrase. And some people claim that if you really look at the grammar of what it's like utterances and you'll discover not only that it's propositional knowledge, not knowing what it's like, but further it it's perceptual. Like it, some people have claimed, Eric Lorman in particular has this uh, argument where he's trying to argue for like a higher order perceptual uh, theory of consciousness, just based on examining what it's like phraseology. And then there's other people that say if you try to understand what it's like, you'll see that it's pretty vacuous. It really doesn't entail anything at all. Anyway, to go back to what in many ways is the source of these discussions. 1974, Thomas Nagel, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? A lot of people's hunches about how to think about so-called what it's likeness revolve around those sorts of thought experiments and those sorts of arguments. So let me, when you tell me knowing what it's like is to have certain kind of recognitional capacity, well, if that's all you're going to tell me about knowing what it's like, it seems open that I know what it's like to be a bat. And how can I know what it's like to be a bat? Well, there's maybe bat experiences just are brain states. And I can know that there's like whenever a bat echolocates and detects the location of a moth that it wants to eat, that there's certain pattern of activation in this region, region B. So I recognize, there's activation in region B again. Do I know what it's like to be a bat? I know that when a bat echolocates the location of a moth, there's this pattern of activation in area B of its brain. Or suppose the global state of the bat's brain encompasses an odd number of neurons. In knowing that, do I know what it's like to be a bat? So a lot of people have these intuitions about knowing what it's like to be a bat, whereby those sorts of things I was just asking you about, none of them count as knowing what it's like to be a bat. So what am I leaving out then? I mean, I'm not accusing you of this because you haven't answered that question yet. But I think other people are going to say, no, that's not what's knowing what it's like is about. So they would, I think, say more. They would try to build in that it's not just recognitional stuff, but it's recognitional stuff that you've gotten through experience. It's recognitional stuff that you apply in introspection. The stuff that I was describing earlier, I'm getting it through my experience in a sense, but it's not about my experience. It's about the bat's experience. Anything I'm getting about the bat is third personal instead of first personal. It's not introspective. It's observational. So that's just a long way of saying probably you would need to build more into your characterization of what it's like to try to capture what people seem to have in mind when they contemplate the Nagel bat stuff. And then I would go a step further and say that once you start building in what you need to build in to kind of hold aloft those intuitions, what you're doing is then you'll find yourself begging the question in favor of dualism or begging the question against physicalism. That it's going to turn out that what you meant by what it's like is, this non-physical property that is only accessible introspectively. But then that's the question, is whether there are such properties. And we need an argument for that.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know if I made this clear, but I meant to be talking about recognition of your own mental states on where they fall under certain mental categories and what mental features they have. I didn't.
Okay, but you probably should still have to add
something
about introspective, right? So, imagine a scenario where I'm recognizing them, but it's because I'm looking at the output of an fMRI scanner that's hooked up to my brain, right? We could come up with these science fictional scenarios whereby, in a strictly physicalistic or third person sort of way, I'm satisfying the recognition requirement. And I think people are going to have the hunch that that's not enough. It's got to be recognition in a special sort of way. But now you need to say more about what the special sort of way is. And further, you got to thread the needle in such a way that you don't accidentally just beg the question against physicalism.
Yeah, I mean, could you just add this thing about it being by introspection and then kind of leave open the details of that introspection, maybe in a way that could be consistent with physicalism in principle? I don't know, something like that. Do you think there's some way? I mean, does that make sense? Or
Yeah. So I think you could set it up that way, but then probably you're not going to be able to get the classic what it's like based arguments off the ground. If you set it up in that neutral sort of way, it's hard to see then how you're going to get the Mary argument off the ground, or um, zombie arguments, inverted spectrum arguments.
yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I guess it's just for me. It's I'm trying to find a sense of the term or phrase, what it's like, or knowing what it's like that I can make sense of. I can understand what's being said, and B, I mean, it seems somewhat relevant or capture what people are normally saying when they use that phrase. And this is kind of the something like this seems to be the closest I can get, because when people start adding in stuff about you know that may presuppose that there's a special non-physical mental property or power or something, that's where, not even just that it might beg the question against physicalism, I'm not even, in many cases, I'm not even sure what's being said. Or the other alternative is people just say, no, it's the what it's like this, it's not analyzable any further, it's just the what it's likeness, either you get it or you don't. I don't know what to say about that. I don't
I
know what,
think
I don't know what's being said.
so. I want to get to the analyzable part of it. There was something else I wanted to say about that though. If you want to try to hang this on recognition, um, one of the, one of the arguments in this neck of the woods that you have to address is an argument that I know of through Michael Ty, but I'm pretty sure he didn't originate it. Maybe this originates from Ned Block, or I'm forgetting. But there's a version of the Mary thought experiment where when she first has a red experience, it's because she's like in this room where suddenly there's all these like color chips flying around, um, and or it's just like this confetti or something like that. Um, Red light goes in her eyes, and she has a red experience. But everything is happening so fast, and there's so many other experiences that she never really is able to appreciate that that one was the red one. So in that moment, she did know what it's like to see red, but she's not able to recognize it later. There's another version of a similar sort of argument that's about amnesia. So imagine like good old fashioned Mary. We're not doing confetti now, or swirling hurricane of paint chips. Just good old fashioned Mary. But then she gets hit on the head after she's seen red. She knows what it's like to see red, and then a coconut falls on her head, and she gets amnesia. So because of the amnesia, she's not able to recognize it. But nonetheless, in that moment, she had the knowledge. Anyway,
Well, she had the
so
experience at
she
least,
had
right?
she right, but so this is the recognition thing. There's a literature that um, centers on the ability hypothesis response to the knowledge argument that you get from Nemero and Lewis. Um, and their suggestion of, well, what the ability is that you gain is, they suggest that it's an ability to imagine and an ability to recognize. And a lot of responses to that from the literature have been the sort of thing that I'm rehearsing right now. That, well, I mean, there are these thought experiments whereby you can plausibly pull apart the knowing what it's like from the ability to recognize. The amnesia is one way to do it. The thing with the swirling confetti is another way to do it. Um, Anyway, back to what it's like. I think it's interesting to follow the kinds of arguments people have made, looking at the syntax of the key terms here. One of which being knowledge, but the other one being we've got a kind of WH knowledge. So there are these syntactic or grammatical arguments that say, if you look at other examples of WH knowledge, like knowing when the podcast is going to start, or knowing who the guest is, or knowing what a carburetor is. When you look at these kinds of WH forms of knowing, there's always some kind of syntactic transformation whereby you can get to what it is that is known. If someone does know it, then there's going to be some proposition such that it's the case that they know that P. So if I know when the podcast is over, there's some proposition of the general form. I know that the podcast is over at fill in the blank for a time, 12:30, whatever. So you take this general kind of view about WH knowledge, and then you go into knowing what it's like, and plausibly, especially if you're looking in like the corpus, you're looking at examples of just ordinary people using this phrase. It looks like it follows the same sort of grammar. You could always come up with some propositional, some proposition or sentence such that that's what you know. So also, I would add, like, a lot of the examples that you'll get from the corpus of people using things like knowing what it's like, it doesn't really look like they're talking about things that are distinctively mental. So I, if I know, you might ask me about a person, what are they like? Or I tell you about some place I visited, you might ask me, what's that like? There's a lot of things that we can bend into the shape of this knowing what it's like that don't really seem to be about someone introspecting their own mental states. Just so to know what it's like is, by the way, it's not really about similarity. The superficial thing about the word like that might lead you to think this is some kind of similarity judgment. There's a lot of examples just from the language that make it clear it's not necessarily relational. You're not saying this is similar to that. You're in knowing what it's like. You just know something of the thing. When I ask you what something is like, I'm just asking you to tell me something true about it, or just tell me some property that it instantiates. That's it. So that leaves it wide open about whether the properties in question are in any way special. Leaves it wide open whether they're necessarily even experiential or mental. Leaves it wide open whether they're physical or not. But if it's that open, it's not really then going to be much of a platform for you to launch what any of the classical anti-physicalist arguments. There's nothing special about knowing what it's like until you deliberately stipulate that there is something special about it. But then the question is, well, why would you do that? What would justify that?
Right. So either you're not going to build something else like that in which case, how is this an anti-physicalist argument, or how are you going to build an anti-physicalist argument on that? Or you do build something like that, and then it's probably just going to be question begging against a physicalist. And either way, it's like you're not really going to have a compelling argument, perhaps, for the against physicalism. Yeah. But more on that particular article. I mean, a lot of it's concerned with illusionism, in particular, as defended and described by Keith Frankish. And part of the discussion there is, well, Frankish characterizes phenomenal states and properties as anomalous or magical, or at least having the appearance of being as such, among other things. But those are the kind of two features he focused on there. And you want to push back on this and suppose that the thought that they appear that way, the thought that they appear that way is itself a sort of illusion, or maybe just like a false belief, because maybe you are a bit hesitant to use the word illusion there, but nevertheless, it's incorrect. They don't really have that appearance. And it may not even be clear to say, what would you even mean to say that they do have that sort of appearance? Yeah, I don't know. Is this all right, or would you add a bit more?
Yeah, I would give you an A. That's a good solid 95% right there. But I would add a few things. The way I understand Frankish, at least in the context of that special issue of Journal of Consciousness Studies that this is all a part of, he's making a claim that's supposed to be a general claim about how consciousness works, that in general, what consciousness is this sort of thing that if you have consciousness, then you're under a certain kind of illusion. And the illusion is that there is such a thing as phenomenal consciousness. The Frankish style illusionist doesn't deny that there's consciousness. They deny a class of very special claims certain people have made about consciousness. That, for example, that there's this special thing which is phenomenal consciousness, that in the lingo of Ned Block, phenomenal consciousness can be distinguished from access consciousness, where access consciousness is the sort of thing you could give a functional theory of. It's the sort of thing that you could define in terms of like information bearing states or representational states. Phenomenal consciousness is this other thing by definition. It's not access consciousness. It's experience. It's what's denoted by what it's like. It's qualitative in some sense. That's what phenomenal consciousness is supposed to be. And the illusionist I'm interpreting as claiming that this is everyone who has consciousness, or at least enough people for it to be generally true. They're under the illusion that there is phenomenal consciousness. And the challenge I try to put for the Frankish style illusionist is there's multiple pieces of it. One piece is to just push back against the claim that this is generally true of people, that they're generally under this illusion. I suspect that it's only a small number of people that are under this so-called illusion, and they're people that have been infected with a certain amount of philosophical education. But normal people, they don't know what the heck you're talking about. My mother, who is normal, she's a normal person, doesn't get inverted qualia. And I've tried many times. Even though I'm a physicalist, I think that the idea of inverted qualia is kind of, deeply broken. I've tried to get her into it. And we had this almost screaming match about a banana. I'm like, Mom, what if the way this banana looks to you is like, she doesn't get it. So if you can't get what the heck inverted banana qualia are, you're really not in any position to say anything about phenomenal consciousness. So one of my lines of attack against Frankish is to raise doubts about how widespread this is, and to suggest that it's probably just a small number of people. But the main challenge that was interesting to me was a separate challenge, and that was the challenge, if there is this illusion, what is the illusion? Tell me what it's an illusion of, right? With other kinds of illusions, when someone says there's this the checkerboard illusion, they could say what the illusion is, what the content of the illusion is. The content of the illusion is the perception as of these two squares on a checkerboard being the exact same shade of gray. That's the illusion, by which I mean that's the content of the illusion. They're in a mental state that has that content. And part of what it means to say that it's illusory is to say that it's inaccurate. In reality, those are not the same shade of gray or whatever. I think I screwed up that example, the checkerboard illusion, but you get it. There's illusions like, for example, the waterfall illusion, where we could state what the content is. It's the illusion that this thing is simultaneously moving and not moving at the same time. Or there's other sorts of illusions. The illusion is that there's red There's red stripes where in actuality it's just a black and white thing that's spinning, and these are illusory colors. So if people are under the illusion that there's phenomenal consciousness, then I think the illusionist incurs the burden of saying, well, what's the content of the illusion? What is that? Now, when you ask other people in the philosophy of mind, what is that? Leave Keith Frankish and the illusionist aside. You just ask your run-of-the-mill person who is dealing with qualia and phenomenal consciousness. Often case, you're going to get something that looks like pointing. They're going to say like, well, I mean, it's that. Like if you have a red experience, then it's that. It's this inward ostension. You're trying to do demonstrative reference to an inner experience. And on the presumption that I'm having the same experience as you are, we could like nod and say to each other, oh yeah, I get it. It's that, right? We're not describing what it is. We're just pointing at it, and since it's there to be pointed to, this is not a completely idle exercise. But that, I don't think the illusionists can help themselves to that sort of move, since they hold that there is no phenomenal consciousness. There's nothing there to be pointed to. So insofar as there's any content whatsoever, it has to be purely descriptive content. It can't be the sort of content that is just a pointing, like someone who has no idea what a whale is. They just point at this big animal coming out of the water and they're like, that thing over there, that thing bit my leg off, and that's why I have a wooden leg. I don't know what that thing is, but we have to hunt it down and kill it. But if there's no thing there, then that thing just doesn't mean anything at all. It has no content. Or if it has any content, the content must be descriptive, right? So when you fail to demonstrate an existing thing, insofar as there is any content, it must be the correlated descriptions or mental predicates that you have on hand. So then the challenge is to Frankish style illusionist, tell me what the illusion is. Tell me what the content is. But that they don't get to help themselves to the demonstrative because there's nothing there to be demonstrated. So then what are they going to do? They're going to have to give me some kind of theory of what qualia would be if there were such things. We could do that for other stuff. Like I could give you a theory, so to speak, of unicorns. Like even though there are no unicorns, I could tell you like, well, it's a magical horse that has only one horn, right? So give me something like that. These states of qualia or phenomenal consciousness that you claim don't exist. What would they be if there were such things? And one thing then that the illusionist can say in response to that is, I think, going to land them into one of two unhappy situations. One sort of thing they could say is going to lead them into the unhappy situation of just being stuck with a vicious circle. So they could say what they mean by phenomenal is qualitative, is what's likeness, is phenomenal, and we're just going in a circle again. That's not really helping. Each of these terms just kind of just bear synonyms for the other term, all of which have just been stipulated into existence by philosophers. None of them really have a true life of their own outside of philosophy. So that's one unhappy position to be in, is to be stuck with this term circle. And that's all the stuff about what it's like. Qualia, qualitative, seems to me to just stick you back in the circle. The other way out is to lean on things like the phrase magic. That's not going to lead you into the term circle. We could we could say what magic is supposed to be. Magic is like, not consistent with physical law. That's what magic is. Or magic is some kind of intentional causation without any natural mechanism underlying the causation. So if wishing worked, like if you could just wish for things and then they would appear, that would be magic. well, the unhappy position that you land in there, if you try to get out of the vicious term circle and say things like, well, it's magic, is that I don't think anyone, or I don't think a large enough people actually think of their own conscious experiences that way. I don't, honestly, I don't think my consciousness seems magic to me. Um, at least not in the ordinary case. The only time I can get myself into a headspace where I can kind of see what people are talking about when they say things like "it's magic," it's it's just it's a miracle that natural physical processes give rise to this. When I get myself in that headspace, I have to do a whole lot of philosophizing. I have to apply a lot of fairly sophisticated, semi-technical philosophy education. But then, it's becoming less and less plausible that this is what the general populace is undergoing when they're conscious. Um, so anyway, that's the argument. I say you had it 95% right. I just wanted to add some of those extra bits.
Yeah, that's awesome, and it's really good stuff there. So like, yeah, I mean, there's also this difference between um, how it appears and to a person and what sort of claims they might make about it. Um, so I don't know. I don't know how much you want to talk about what exactly an appearance is here, but maybe something like, well, minimally, there's facts about how they would characterize a state, um, just in referring to it, and then facts about, well, what features or properties they would attribute to those sorts of states. And those, I mean, it seems weird to, as you perhaps saying, um, think that the way they're understanding the state, the way they might characterize or refer to it, just involves mention of it being magical or something else like that. That just seems. I mean, I don't do that. I'd be very surprised if very many people did that at all. Even if a fair amount of people would attribute that feature to those sorts of states, it's not kind of part of the appearance or what they have in mind when they characterize or refer to that state. If that makes sense. Is that
Yeah, there's a related. I mean, I agree with you. Like my mental states don't seem magical to me. Um, I will confess they do sometimes seem puzzling, and I confess that sometimes I feel like there is a hard problem of consciousness. When people say like there's a hard problem of consciousness, I understand it. I get it. I don't agree always that there's a hard problem, but I don't think it's incoherent. At least not. It's not incoherent the way four-sided triangles is incoherent. Um, David Chalmers once said, and I don't know if he did this in writing or if it was just personal conversation, but he said that his conscious states seem non-physical to him. My conscious states don't seem non-physical to me. Um, Mostly, the way my conscious states seem to me is just neutral with respect to whether they're physical or not. Um, I don't think Chalmers is lying or mistaken about the way things seem to him. I will grant to him that his mental states seem non-physical to him. Although I do wonder, what
what does that seem? What does that seem? What is that like? I don't know.
yeah, that's a really good question. Because there's certain sorts of there's a lot that's complicated here. So one potential complication is the distinction between something seeming to be not the case and something not seeming to be the case. Often in English, we just completely conflate those two different things. But if you're careful about it, you can hear the difference. Um, so it might be the case that it just is never the case that mental states seem physical. But that's very different from it often being the case that they seem non-physical, right? So like until I brought it up, you probably had no opinion whatsoever about whether you were in, like whether there was a rhinoceros in the room with you. It would nonetheless be true to say that it didn't seem to you like there was a rhinoceros in the room. But that's different from it seeming to you like there's not a rhinoceros in the room. Now that you're thinking about it and you're looking around the room, it seems to you like there's not the rhinoceros. Now, when we look at these different kinds of possible contents that for seemings, some of them it's going to be. I don't mean to make this pun, but it's going to seem to us like they have to be intellectual, that they have to involve a lot of conceptual thought. So, for example, if it seems to you like it's Wednesday, that's a thing that happens, especially if you have a long holiday weekend, your sense of what day of the week gets thrown off. And I often have this conversation with my wife after one of those long weekends, like, oh, I know it's Monday, but it really just feels like it's still Sunday. Or I know it's Tuesday, but it kind of feels like it's Friday already. So we have those sorts of seemings. But arguably, the only way it can seem to you like it's Wednesday is if you have the concept of Wednesday and you're able to think that it's Wednesday. Wednesdayness does not seem like the sort of thing that could be given to visual perception. There's not like a visual however Wednesdayness gets in here, it has to involve a lot of later more intellectual or conceptual stuff. It doesn't seem like the sort of thing that could be part of an early stage perceptual response. So we might, based on those kinds of remarks, make a distinction between conceptual or intellectual seemings. And what lives on that side of the fence is like, it seems to me like we're never going to solve the problem of quantum gravity. Or it seems to me that like mereological nihilism is probably not defensible. Those are intellectual seemings. It couldn't be perceptual. And then there's other sorts of seemings like that could so it seems like there's a red spot on the wall. It seems like it's over 100 degrees out right now, right? Those can be plausibly, those are perceptual seemings or sensory seemings. They don't require much in the way of concepts. Probably a baby can be appeared to thusly, or a non-human animal, like things can seem red or hot to them, even though the baby or the non-human animal just can't ever, it can never appear to them that there's going to be a problem solving the quantum gravity. It can never appear to them that something is happening on a Wednesday instead of a Tuesday, because that's so. Anyway, back to knowing what it's like, or back to assessing Frankish's claims that there's some kind of illusion here. The question arises of like, well, how did things appear? And this is important not only for the sort of arguments that Frankish is kind of giving, but there's these larger issues about like, well, what counts as the data for a theory of consciousness? And there's a lot of fights that occur about like, who gets to say what the data are that a theory of consciousness needs to explain. People that are much more aligned with Daniel Dennett, for example, much happier saying that the data are these things that we could give very relatively neutral or third personal translations of without loss. And then there's other people that are going to claim like, no, there's these very specific first personal claims that we have to credit as being true. That is entered into the data set. What gets into the data set or not is going to help. Maybe won't fully determine, but it'll help determine who stands or falls in these debates over panpsychism, dualism, other kinds of anti-physicalism. So anyways, that is just to say that's a really big and tough question, what to count as an appearance here, or what to count as a seeming. I think for to bring it back to the Frankish stuff and the assessment of Frankish style illusionism, it probably doesn't matter whether we're talking about an intellectual seeming or a sensory seeming. The issue is going to be more about like, is that widespread that people are under this illusion? If the only people that are under this so-called illusion, if the people who have this illusory seeming or this illusory appearance are just like grad students, people that have been through philosophy grad school, then it's not a very interesting claim. If it's more widespread, then you've got something worth calling, as at least in some moods, Frankish calls it, a theory of consciousness. Illusionism is supposed to be at least part of a theory of what consciousness is. Consciousness is this thing that a significant number of us are under an illusion. We have this mistaken appearance.
Right. Yeah, obviously there's a lot more that could be discussed there. I do want to cover something you cover in the end, which is, I mean, I guess the second part of the title as well, which is that you kind of conclude by suggesting that your preferred view is something more like Qualia Quietism, which I take it involves kind of remaining silent on whether qualia and the like exist, since it's not clear what those terms mean or even if they mean anything. Is that roughly the idea there behind qualia quietism? Or?
Yes, yeah. So one way of stating qualia quietism, just even quietism more generally, not just qualia quietism, but someone might be a quietist about the metaphysics of time, like so the sorts of things that A theorists and B theorists argue about. Someone might just say there's really no issue there. So one way of understanding quietism is in contrast with what you might call a limitativism or nihilism. So like an eliminativist or a nihilist is making a claim which we can regiment as a negative existentially quantified claim. So they're saying it's not the case that there exist unicorns. Now, in making that claim, they are under some burden to say what a unicorn would be if there were any things. So if you look in the history of science for examples of what I'm calling nihilism or limitativism, you could see the general reaction to the phlogiston theory of combustion, or the general scientific reaction to the proposal that there's such a thing as the luminiferous ether. The people that were defending the existence of phlogiston or luminiferous ether gave enough content, they said enough to describe what that's supposed to be, for someone else to come along and say, yeah, that, and by that, they're not pointing at anything, they're now giving a description. The medium through which light waves propagate, or the substance that is released from all combusting things, in virtue of which they count as combusting, that does not exist. That's eliminativism or nihilism. You have to be able to use the concept in order to deny that the concept applies to anything. You got to be able to use the concept of a unicorn to say unicorns don't exist. But the quietist is someone who comes along and says, in kind of a Wittgensteinian spirit of which we cannot speak, we must remain silent, these concepts are so damaged, they're so ill-formed, that you can't even make a coherent negative existential claim. Oh, okay. So just the basic contrast between the eliminativist and the quietist is the eliminativist thinks that there's a concept in question that's in good enough shape for them to make a coherent negative existential claim. And the quietist is saying, no, the concept is so damaged that you can neither assert nor deny anything using it. So where an eliminativist would say there aren't any qualia, the quietist would say, I really don't want to use the word qualia. No, thank you. So the quietist is neither asserting nor denying the existence of qualia. They're just like, look, this is just such a garbage concept. Please leave me alone so I can go talk about something else. Like, for example, access consciousness. So that's qualia quietism. one way to think of it is it's more Frankish than Frankish. So Frankish thinks there's these false ideas or false conceptions, and I think that there's just not even the conceptions. We don't even have enough of a grip on what phenomenal consciousness is supposed to be for it to really make much sense to say that it doesn't exist. So it's more of just a refusal to play the qualia game.
Yeah, I was wondering. Um, I don't know. I'm not sure that I'm fully on the same page because I mean maybe there's certain ways that we might use the term qualia that make sense. So for example, I was thinking we have terms for a variety of sorts of experiences. If you don't want to use the word experience, I could just start tokening the different terms we have here, and something is qualia or a quail if it's an instance of one of those, something like that. Maybe I think that's kind of how I use the term qualia. It's maybe not so far off from how many people might use it. What do you think about this? Like we have this notion for pain experiences or certain visual experiences, whatever, and we might list a whole bunch of things out, and something's a qualitative experience or a quail, just in case it's one of those. Does that kind of make sense? Or?
I mean, I think there are proposals for how to use qualia that by themselves, there's really nothing wrong with the proposals. The problem arises is when you try to get the people making those proposals to agree with anybody else that want to use the word, right? So one way of setting this all up is to say, like, leave qualia and phenomenal consciousness aside for a moment. Let's just parse the mind up into some, basic kinds of distinctions. One way to do it that at least seems to me not to be terribly controversial, although everything in philosophy gives rise into a total controversy. But anyway, so one thing you might say is like, okay, you've got a cognitive system here. Some distinctions we could draw is between the states of the system that are representational, that carry representational content, and the ones that don't. And of the ones that carry representational content, they have properties aside from the representational content. Call those the vehicular properties of those content-bearing states. So whatever, I've got a neural representation that there's a tree out there. That there's a tree out there is its content. But that I have the neural representation now, or that the neural representation has an odd number of neurons activated instead of an even number of neurons. Those are properties of the vehicle. Notice I haven't said qualia yet. I'm just like carving up the mind in ways independently of the question of whether there are qualia or whether there's phenomenal consciousness. Continuing with these classifications, we could talk about some of the representations as being conceptual representations and contrast those with possible non-conceptual representations. So maybe early sensory neural states carry content, representational content, but they don't satisfy other conditions that would allow them to count as full-blown concepts. They're more just like these little pointy indicator things, but they wouldn't enter into inferences in the way that you would think, say, the concept of Wednesday has to be able to be related to other sorts of concepts. That's what makes it a concept, is that it can enter into those sorts of inferential relations, whereas some like low level sensory state or some subpersonal state of like syntactic computation, that doesn't count as conceptual. And then, of the conceptual stuff, we can talk about the beliefs versus the desires, the intentions versus the judgments. Okay, now that we've got this big set of divisions and distinctions and labels and all that, we enter into that picture and say, well, let's take the label qualia and stick it on some part of this. Maybe what you want to stick qualia onto is the non-conceptual representational contents that are introspectively accessible. Okay, by itself, there's nothing wrong with that. But there's other sorts of things that we could bring in that now make me lose confidence in there being a point to that project. one thing to bring in is that there's going to be a whole bunch of people in this discussion that are going to say, no way, that's not qualia. What you've just described is a kind of access consciousness, and we told you that we mean not access consciousness, we mean this other thing. So you're just saying like, okay, there's a certain kind of access consciousness that you want to identify with phenomenal consciousness. There's certain kinds of functionalistically specifiable representational contents that you want to label as qualia. By itself, that's fine, but you're going to have these other people that just disagree with you. And in this larger community, it looks like chaos where no one can really agree on how to use the term. A different kind of problem for this sort of project would be to bring up specific questions, like the sorts of questions that Dennett raises in Quieting Qualia. So these kind of puzzling sorts of cases, like the case of the coffee tasters, Chase and Sanborn. One of them says the coffee, the taste of the coffee has changed, and since the taste of the coffee has changed, they don't like tasting the coffee anymore. The other person says the taste of the coffee has remained the same. They just don't like that taste anymore. Now, we could presuppose that Chase and Sanborn are, for all sakes and purposes, physically just exactly the same. For, modulo the fact that they're making these separate claims about their the way things seem to them. We can ask questions about Chase and Sanborn up in terms of qualia. We could say like, well, one of these guys is saying that the qualia have stayed the same, but their judgments about it have changed, and the other one is saying the qualia have changed, and that's why they're making the judgments that they're making. Now, as far as like what their ultimate like judgments are, like what they're ultimately saying about the coffee is, it's the same. They're both saying we don't want to drink it anymore. That's what they're saying. Their behaviors are such that they're going to now stop drinking it or slow down in drinking it, or only drink it if you pay them a certain amount of money. But if we ask questions like, well, which one of these is right about their own qualia, and how would you decide? It just looks hopeless. And so those are the sorts of considerations that make me think that ultimately this project is going nowhere. Now, if you wanted to say like, look, I'm just going to bite the bullet, this is the way I want to use the word qualia, I don't think there's an argument against that. I think you could come up with a completely consistent theory and then just like label some parts of the theory qualia. And it'll bear some resemblance to the ways that some people use the term qualia, but there's going to be so much disagreement. Nonetheless, just linguistic chaos that I don't see really what the point is or what the gains are. So, a lot of this devolves into the questions of like rhetorical strategy. So there's this point in the exchange between me and Frankish that you see in that volume where he responds to me and all that, where in some ways he concedes. He's like, yeah, qualia quietism in some sense it is a more true account, but rhetorically it's a disaster. What he says in the article, it's like there's this comedy sketch with from I think the Bob Newhart show or something, where there's someone is complaining to their psychiatrist that whenever they do this thing, they become miserable in this particular way. And the psychiatrist's advice is, so stop doing that. Don't do that. And that's it. There's a sense in which like that's exactly the right advice. If only they could follow that advice, problem solved. But the problem is like it's really difficult advice to follow. And so Frankish's criticism of Qualia Quietism is like, yeah, it's probably true, Mandik, but like it's such a hard sell. So few people are going to want to go there. And I suspect similar sorts of things are true of illusionism, that so many people just want to believe in consciousness and qualia that on some days I'm like, well, let's let them have it, and but then they don't agree on anything, and that's when I start to think like, oh, maybe that was a mistake. We shouldn't have just let them have it because they're just making a mess of things. But anyway, just to kind of repeat the earlier point, I don't think there's a problem with the view that you're describing in and of itself. The problems start to show up when we ask questions like, well, how does this hang with the way other people want to use the word? Or how would you resolve the sorts of conflicts that the Chase and Sanborn um, thing engenders? There's some sense in which your response to Chase and Sanborn probably just would be stipulative. You just stipulate like, well, qualia are those things that aren't judgments, but are like lower level in the processing stream. And you could give objective criteria for the presence or absence of those. And then in theory, you could decide the debate about who's right, Chase or Sanborn. But you would, what you don't have. So even though the theory that you would come up with would be internally consistent, what you don't have yet is any reason for believing that theory over any of the other ways of just pinning the qualia label onto this parsing of cognitive systems into the non-conceptual representations and the conceptual representations, the early stage and the late stage representations, the ones the contents versus the vehicles.
Is that just to say that there's maybe a great many different ways you might use the term, and you don't have a particular motivation for using one of those
Yes.
ways over the others?
Yeah, I'm happy with that way of putting it.
Yeah, I was also wondering, would it maybe be fair to characterize your approach here as not so much as quietism, but sort of abolitionism of the term? Like let's just like stop using that term, even though there's some ways that we might use it that I'm not going to be quietist about, because it seems like it's a sensible way. You're saying something that could be entirely factual or something if you use it that way, but nevertheless, it's too much of a semantic linguistic mess, and there's so much disagreement on how to use it that it's probably best to just eliminate it from our discourse altogether. Maybe that's the way to go.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with that. If there is a problem, it would live in the neck of the woods of trying to contrast this claim with other sorts of positions in philosophy. So like old school Paul Churchland style eliminativism about the propositional attitudes. There, enough can be said about so-called propositional attitudes that you can give a roughly modus tollens kind of argument against them. You can say like, well, look, I mean, if there were propositional attitudes, there would be these things that, that this, and this are true of. And then you go on to argue that like there's nothing in the brain that's true of, and whatever these things are, they got to be in the brain. So therefore, you can give enough content to the claim. You could give enough content to the concept of a propositional attitude that even though what Paul Churchland is recommending is that we eliminate that vocabulary from our discourse, it's still in good enough shape that he can deny the existence of those things and give a certain kind of argument against those things existing. Where, so one way of hearing what abolitionism is, Paul Churchland style eliminativism about the propositional attitudes, is abolitionism. But there's a little more to it. It's not just rejecting the terminology. It's rejecting the terminology for special reasons that have to do with, thinking the terminology has a very specific kind of content. The sort of thing that I am guided by, or one of the sorts of things I'm guided by in thinking that quietism is different from that kind of eliminativism, is like the stuff from Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. So, for example, the discussion of the beetle in the box. Um, typical Wittgenstein, it's very condensed, and you've got to, the reader has to fill in a lot of the blanks to see how there's an argument there. But anyways, I mean, in the beetle in the box passage, there's this term, beetle, that by hypothesis, it could be anything, or it could be nothing at all. And the suggestion is that it just doesn't really have a role in the language game. If meaning is use, this thing doesn't have a use, and so therefore it's meaningless. I think that's a fairly natural way of reading what the point of the beetle of the box discussion is. That seems to me more like Quietism, right? So if someone wanted to say, what I mean by beetle is a certain kind of insect, or if someone wanted to say, what I mean by beetle is whatever happens to be in my box, even if it's nothing at all. Like, if people wanted to stipulate a sense for beetle, they could, but a single person stipulating something is not enough to give an item a use in a language game. You would need something like coordination across people. Like if everyone got on board with you and agreed, okay, that's how they're going to use the word beetle, then now maybe we're going somewhere. But absent that, then the suggestion is to just dismiss any of all the beetle talk as just pointless. I don't know.
Yeah.
Is that helping at all?
No, it is. I can sort of see that. But yeah, I mean, whether this is more like that sort of scenario or more like something else, I don't know. I think there's a bit more to discuss there. Maybe I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, just let me say one more thing. If you look at the Qualia paper from Daniel Dennett, he says, like, look, people have been, they're pretty cagey about defining consciousness or defining qualia, but, says Dennett, it seems like what they, all these different people that give me, Dan Dennett, a hard time, what they seem to have in mind is like qualia are ineffable and private and intrinsic. And so then he gives a sequence of arguments about why there's nothing that's ineffable, and there's nothing that's intrinsic, and there's nothing that's private. And then the response of a lot of people who want to hold on to qualia and qualia talk is just to reject that that's part of the definition of qualia. Right? And then they go on their merry way and they keep on talking about qualia. But the qualia quietist has got a different strategy. And part of its plausibility comes from, like, the fact that quining qualia already happened. The paper was already published. The discussion has moved on. Like, we see what happens when you try to pin a definition on the qualia freaks and then argue against qualia that way. They just move the goalposts. So part of the motivation for qualia quietism is to say something like, look, if that's what y'all are going to do with the term qualia, then I will no longer play that game. No more qualia talk for me.
Yeah, I was going to add just on the relation to Keith Frankish here, which is that, I mean, this may not even really be like an extension of some of the things he's written at all. Like, I know there's at least one of his papers where he, it's been a while since I read this, so I might get something wrong here, but basically he tries to argue that either what we mean by the term qualia is going to build so much into it, in which case it's just not something that exists, or it's so empty and like not really saying anything that It's not going to serve the use that the term is meant to serve in referring to this particular sort of state. And, well, this latter option, that's kind of like the meaningless option. It's not really saying it. It's not like clear what is being said, or nothing's really being said by the term. I don't know, maybe that's kind of getting close to sort of Quietism or non-cognitivism, maybe, about that term.
Yeah. Yes, I would distinguish Quietism from non-cognitivism. Um, I mean, but maybe I'm not up enough on the literature about non-cognitivisms. But as I hear, like when I hear non-cognitivism in meta ethics, I think of things like expressivism or emotivism, whereby ethical would look on the face of it to be judgments attributing properties to actions or states of affairs are really just like expressions of approval or disapproval. So when I say that's bad, I'm not actually saying that action has the property of being badness. I'm doing something more like saying, blah, drop kicking babies, blah, which it expresses my disapproval, but it's not actually saying anything. Um, that's that's nonetheless a pretty specific claim about what the content is. You're claiming it has a content. It's just not a cognitive content. It's more the content that goes along with saying boo or hooray. Um, where the qualia quietist is saying something stronger, that there's just no content. It's you guys are messing around with words, but you haven't really given it enough of a use. There's not enough of a stable use across multiple people in a community. It's not doing anything for you. Um, but yeah, I mean, like if someone wanted to do the sort of thing that you're doing, in and of itself, that's fine. And further, if like someone wanted to do the sort of thing that you were doing, and then could show that there's like dividends from it, like say like, look, I'm just going to stipulate that we use the words this way, this way, this way. But then what you get from that, it's like some really cool experiments or something like that, or some surprising um, results. Well, I mean, maybe you were onto something there, but it seems like that hasn't happened yet.
I mean, it could even just be that it's an efficient way of talking, or it's like it might just be a um, neat terminology that, like, if otherwise, rather than using the word qualia, you want to use some longer expression in terms of access or something else that's a bit more complicated to say or understand, maybe um, using the term qualia would have benefit there. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so you
That's
take, for
one way.
example, someone like Michael Tai, late '90s, first order representational theory of consciousness, which was his panic theory of consciousness, where PANIC stands for poised, abstract, non-conceptual, intentional content. And so the basic idea was is like, look, there's certain kinds of representations. They're not conceptual representations. They're not intellectual judgment type representations. They're more like these pointer sorts of states in low levels of sensory processing. And further, they're the ones that are not representing particular things. This is the abstract part of it. They're representing um, repeatables. So if I know what it's like to see red, and I know that Swamp Pete is a perfect duplicate of me, then plausibly I know what it's like for Swamp Pete to see red also. If I know what this apple looks like, and you tell me there's an apple in the other room that is intrinsically just like this one, well, I know what the other apple looks like also. Um, and if you want to say like, boom, there you go, that's qualia. For here on out, that's what I mean by qualia. I think that's fine. But there's so many other people that are like, nope, that's not qualia, that I give up. I lose patience. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. I guess I'm good with that. Um, Yeah. So another one of your articles had to do with well, you make a kind of interesting argument against color sensations, or against color sensations as sometimes conceived. So you particularly bring up Sellers and Rosenthal. And I don't know how much I should introduce here, but um, central to your argument is the um, recognition of various color illusions. We can judge that. You talked about some of this before, but we can judge that two colors are the same when they're different, or they're different when they're the same, and frequently this sort of judgment is based on features not immediate in experience, or not based on the judgment of colors themselves. Like I said, maybe spatial features, shapes, etc. And his way I'm understanding your argument is that this seems to go against some theories of sensation, according to which sensations of colors in some way explain our ability to recognize and infer these other features. But if our perception of these other features are informing the way we perceive the colors, then it's kind of getting it backwards, that theory of color sensation. Is that kind of the way to think about your argument here, or maybe you could add on to that?
Yeah. Once again, I'm going to give you an A. That was great. Perfectly great. Want to add one or two little things though. So part of the argument is that once you appreciate in these certain kinds of cases how the conceptual level is doing the work, it doesn't look like there's any work for the sensations to be doing. The only way to save sensations would be if they were doing a job that actually didn't need to be done. So one way to put it is, the target theory of sensations, the thing I'm trying to argue against, would say that sensations are like kind of what people said about raw feels. That prior to any conceptual processing, there are these like input states to the mind, the same sorts of states that a newborn infant could be in, a non-human animal could be in. These are the raw feels, the raw materials um, of perception. And then the specific versions of that theory that I'm looking at are like Sellers and Rosenthal, as you mentioned. And they make very specific claims about how like only after those sensations are in are you in a position to so if we're focusing on vision, only after you get the color sensations, then are you able to see shape. So you have to have a bunch of like this part of the visual field has red in it, and this part of the visual field has green in it, and only in virtue of that first being there are you able to come to see it as a red triangle on a green background, as opposed to a red square on a green background. So first you have the color sensations, and then later on you get some kind of content about space, or similarly, object recognition. Only after you have a distribution of yellow in the visual field with such and such shape are you able to apply your concept of banana and recognize that as a banana. Um, but the argument that I try to build is to say that there's certain kinds of illusions where it looks like the only way you would come to see this non-blue thing as blue, or this non-square thing as square, is if you already had these concepts in play. So there's something that isn't yellow, but it looks yellow because you recognize it as a banana, and you've got stored away in there that bananas are yellow. Um, so it doesn't look like the sensation is doing anything, unless what's happening is this really wasteful, pointless thing where after the concepts are triggered, after you recognize that it's a banana, your brain then creates the sensation of color for you to enjoy in your Cartesian theater, but all the work has been done already. Um, and the work is like correctly identifying what's happening in your immediate environment. That you've completed that process once all the conceptual stuff has has been triggered. And if you want to hypothesize that conceptual stuff has some later downstream effects that fill the colors in, and you want to call those later downstream effects sensations, you could if you wanted to, but you've abandoned the original theory, which was that these are like the raw inputs, and only later do you get the triggering of the relevant concepts. So this is so part of what I'm trying to do here is to point out that there's number one, this can't just be an a priori theory. Like it doesn't just flow from the concept of perception or the concept of sensation that things have to work this way. It's an empirical gambit or empirical hypothesis. What I'm saying is that it doesn't have to be this way. Now I'm leaving it open that maybe it is that way after all. I see this as very similar to the literature that rose up around Dennett's claims about filling in. Are you familiar with this stuff? Um, it mostly appears in 91, Consciousness Explained. There's this phenomenon that Dennett talks about, which is, how do you account for our experience of our visual field, given the fact that there are these blind spots corresponding to where the optic nerve connects to the retina. There are these blind spots that we almost never notice. How can it be that we have blind spots, these big giant blind spots in our visual field, and we seldom notice them? Now, a lot of people think that the brain has to do something called filling in. So if I'm looking at a red wall, like a uniformly red wall, and I'm having an experience that I would describe as being an experience of uniformly red expanse, how do we account for the portion of my visual field that it corresponds to the blind spots in my retina? Like if you were to put a dot on the wall that exactly coincided with, you stabilized my percept relative to my eye motion so that the dot was always falling in my blind spot, I wouldn't see the dot. I wouldn't notice the dot. How can that be? One hypothesis is that somehow the brain is creating content and literally, in some sense of literally, filling it in. It would, like if instead of a visual field, we were just doing some Photoshop, you would have to select the area and then, there's like a tool called the paint can or something like that. And you're fairly literally filling in that region. You're designating the pixels in that region as having red in it. However Photoshop works, that's basically what Photoshop is doing. Photoshop is doing filling in. And if instead of a uniform red expanse, you were looking at wallpaper, Dennett's example is wallpaper designed by Andy Warhol with a whole bunch of Marilyn Monroes on it. If there was, or if you were looking at stripes that look like candy canes, and these red and you've got these long things with red and white stripes running perpendicular to their length. If one of the candy canes goes into the blind spot region, you don't see the candy cane as being blocked or broken or occluded. Does the brain fill in the way Photoshop, a designer using Photoshop, would fill in and put stripes into that region? Then it says, well, it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to fill in. Here's a way the brain might work. The brain might just say something that's kind of like a linguistic representation that just says, like, there's a bunch of Marilyns. So a linguistic representation could represent, like with a sentence in English, can say, there's a whole bunch of Marilyns on the wall without specifying where in space the Marilyns are, without specifying how many Marilyns there are. So that's one solution to this problem. And one way to describe that solution is that it's just saying that there's no filling in. Now, people have come along, Pat Churchland being one of them. A lot of people have demonstrated experimentally that, as a matter of fact, Dennett is wrong. As a matter of fact, the brain does do something that's worth calling filling in. Now, depending on how you describe Dennett's argument, he wins or loses. One way of describing his argument is the conclusion is that the brain doesn't have to fill in, or a mind doesn't. It's not like a priori or analytic that there has to be filling in. I think Dennett is right that it could just be the Moore Maryland's thing. But I also think that what Churchland and other people have demonstrated fairly convincingly is that in some sense there is filling in. And even though in theory the brain could get by without it, as a matter of fact, it's sloppy. Evolution is all sorts of sloppy. Evolution does not come up with the optimal solution. It just comes out with the one that works good enough. So maybe there's filling in. A better brain wouldn't burn any calories doing filling in, but that's the way that our brains are. So I see my arguments against sensations as being kind of having a kind of similar form, where at least if you read the Sellers and Rosenthal versions of these sensation theories, it kind of looks like, to quote David Lewis, there's a whiff of analyticity. It kind of seems like they're presenting this as like, this has got to be the way that it works. This is just what it means to be a sensation. A sensation is this pre-conceptual, pre-spatial sensory thing. And what it means for something to be a judgment or to be a concept is to be something that comes after. So it's all part of the ideas or the theoretical terms that they have these, they play these functional roles. And then I'm coming along saying like, no, it doesn't have to work that way. It could work in this way whereby it's all conceptual. Like, yes, there's information coming in before the concepts are triggered, but no, there's really no good reason to call that stuff sensations. It's not satisfying the general functional profile that your theory said. Now, someone could come along and prove empirically that there is something that is happening in an early stage prior to the conceptual stuff and the spatial stuff. They could do that. Or someone could say like, well, I guess what this all shows is that sensations can be these late stage things, kind of filling in that, strictly speaking, doesn't need to be done, but for some weird reason, that's how the brain does it. I think those are open possibilities. But the way I see the argument is as parallel to the version of the Dennett filling in argument that I think is so far still stands. And that is the version of the argument that says the mind does not have to work this way. It's a genuine open possibility about whether it works this way. And further, if it did work this way, that would be further evidence that that Mother Nature has been very sloppy in the way she puts us together. There's a lot of just extra crap that we don't need.
Yeah, I definitely sympathize with that. So, like, I was wondering, I mean, someone could have different accounts of what sensations are supposed to be or what they mean by the term sensation. Apart from this sort of Sellers Rosenthal thing, maybe you would think that it's not that they just play this initial role in some sequence, but it's a way of characterizing some of our mental life as a sort of sensations that happen, but it's all kind of connected and with more conceptual stuff and other cognitive processes, and all the same, we still have something worth calling sensation, even if it's not thinking of sensations in the way that Sellers or Rosenthal might think of it. I mean, maybe you'd want me to fill in more details there, but
yeah, so one version of that I would be somewhat happy with would be to say that the main thing that you want sensations for, at least in philosophy of mind, and this is a point Sellers makes, we need to give some kind of account of what the difference is between thinking that there's a banana on the table without seeing that there's a banana on the table, and thinking that there's a banana on the table because we're currently seeing that there's a banana on the table. That that seems like a difference we have to account for. One way to account for that difference is to say that only one of those things involves sensations, right? It's the when you see that there's a banana on the table, you've got all these visual sensations. Among them are the color sensations. When you merely think that there's a banana on the table, you could think that while having completely different sensations or maybe no sensations at all. So that's one way to account for that difference. But another way to account for that difference, at least in theory, is you could say, like, look, in some sense, the only things that live in the mind are thoughts. And further, just to make this really extreme, the language of thought is true. So when you're in any kind of state, there's some set of sentences tokened in your language of thought. And the difference between what we call merely thinking that there's a banana on a table versus seeing that there's a banana on a table is that in merely thinking there's a banana on a table, all you need is like one sentence, and it's there's a banana on the table. But what we call seeing that there's a banana on a table, you just think about all the extra stuff that you're in a position to report and say about the banana in that case. And then on this language of thought, purely thought based theory, the seeing case is just a whole bunch more sentences. You're not simply tokening the sentence, there's a banana on a table, but there's a lot more specificity, still purely sententially represented. But there's a lot of specificity, like the banana is oriented this way, like the part that was previously attached to the rest of the banana tree is closer to the window than the sink. The banana has this many spots. They're this shade of yellow. In theory, that could all be encoded sententially, and there's no real difference in kind, just a difference in quantity. The one case you've got one sentence, the other case you've got 100 of them, and that's the difference. And so you might, if you wanted to save the word sensation, you could say, oh, all right, sensations are like when there's a whole bunch of sentences. Just that's sensation. And so if you wanted to keep the word that way, you could. I should add that one unusual thing about this paper is it was published in a scientific journal, and the journal that it was published in, it enabled this feature whereby people could log into the journal website and make comments. And I didn't realize that until several months later. I discovered a couple psychologists had commented on the article and they hated it. They were just like so mean to me, so savage. I'm not going to name their names, but they really hurt my feelings. The vitriol they unleashed on me. And the bottom line, as far as I could tell, is like they really love sensations. They didn't actually have any arguments that I could detect. I didn't see any evidence that they followed my argument. But it kind of just seemed like there better be sensations. How dare you? How dare you say there are no sensations? Like, wow. Really got under their skin. And I think part of that is, and this is very speculative. I think a lot of people are attracted, especially in psychology, they're attracted to something rough, some kind of rough positivism. Right? Like that's what science is all about, is this, like, call it experience or whatever. There's like this kind of foundation. And yeah, sensations, they live there. And then here comes this weird philosopher telling us there's none of that. It just seems like crazy talk. Whatever there is, it's got to be the sort of thing that a phenomenalist or a solipsist or a logical positivist would allow that there is. So there damn well better be sensations at the end of the day.
Yeah. There's a lot more to discuss there, but I want to cover a couple more things before we end off.
Yeah, sure.
So it's another one of your papers, and you talk a bit about like mind uploading thought experiments and
metaphysical daring as a post-human survival strategy. That's one of my favorite papers of mine.
it's a really interesting paper, and one thing that you remark, well, you remark that you're sort of pessimist about that debate between people who think that. Well, I took it you're a pessimist about the debate, and not just pessimist that, well, we don't survive mind uploading, or how would you
Yeah, so
frame
there's
your
a
position
first
on that?
order. Yeah, sorry. So there's like a first order debate about whether it's possible to survive mind uploading, and there's a way of conducting that debate where you can assume that all the third person accessible things that this technology is supposed to achieve will be achieved. So, and of course, there's all sorts of empirical and technical questions thereby begged about whether that's actually possible. But it's agreed upon in this like philosophical corner of the debate that, at least hypothetically, you could scan someone's brain and to some arbitrary level of detail get all the information out about where the particles were or what the synapses weights were or what the connections were, and then make a thing. um, Maybe it's a physical clone, like in in Star Trek matter transporter sort of situation, where you accidentally press receive twice, and now you've got two Captain Kirks. Or you could upload it to a computer and now have what you might call a simulation of your brain, and it could drive a virtual body or it could drive a robot body. But the virtual body or the robot body would be, at least from some third personal perspective, just like you. It would answer questions in all the same ways you would answer questions. It would express its preferences in all the same ways you would express your preferences. It would point at things the way you point at things. So it's agreed upon that all that's going to happen. The metaphysical debate, and this is what I'm skeptical of ever resolving rationally, the debate is about whether that counts as you surviving. So we scan your brain and then we use it to make Robo Pete, and then we take the original Pete and drop him in a volcano. Does Pete survive even though like the original Pete didn't? Does Pete live on in a robot body? That's the question. And the people that say yes and the people that say no, I think that their arguments are equally convincing. Um, and I see no way of making progress on that. Um, it seems like one of those metaphysical debates. It's not going anywhere. People have certain intuitions that one of them you might put modally, right? Like so, I, like I we could have, instead of uploading me into one robot, we could upload me into two robots, and each of the robots get the same software. They get the same data. Um, those robots could go on and have different experiences and based on those go in different directions, and that raises the question like, well, if I survive as a robot, which robot do I survive as, given that there could be two of them or three of them or four of them, and they could go on to diverge in all these different ways. Do I survive as all of them? It seems there's really no argument against the proposal that you survive as all of them. That you have these you have these you survive as this kind of like collective entity or somewhat abstract entity, and despite these differences, it's all you. It's a little strange because now you could be multiple places at once. You could have your different instances doing things that are different, deviating psychologically. But I think it's still open. Like there's no internal contradiction to the assertion that Mandik has lived on. Just like you can have there's one paper or one novel, but there's multiple drafts out there, and some of the drafts have slightly different things in them. Which one is Moby Dick, or which one is the King James Bible, or which one is metaphysical daring as a post-human survival strategy? One answer is um, they all are. None of them individually are the one, but in some sense they are all It's just one novel. There's been thousands of printings of Moby Dick. Some of them are hardcover, some are softcover, some of them are the Kindle edition. But it's just one novel. And maybe people are like that. They're like Moby Dick, in that you could have multiple editions or printings or volumes of, one of them's on the planet Mars and one of them was destroyed in the 1800s. But nonetheless, it's just one novel. It could just be one person, even though I've got multiple robot bodies. Some of them are on Jupiter, and every so often we have a literal reunion. We bring the robots together and blend their minds, and I don't. So the first order metaphysical debate about whether one and the same person can survive these radical changes in implementation, I don't think there's any way of resolving it. There's not going to be some knockdown proof. It's a stalemate. I think you could break the stalemate though, but not rationally, in the sense that of there being a deductive argument. It's still rational in the sense that like there's non-idiotic reasons for embracing the one versus the other.
Well, yeah, I think it's an interesting topic. I was wondering what you think about my approach, which is going to be roughly that I'm also a pessimist, but maybe for a different reason, which is that I think our notion of person or same person is just insufficiently precise to decide a case like this. So someone asked me, is it the same person? No fact of the matter. I'm not saying there's some epistemic limitation there. It's just there is no fact of the matter. That's kind of all there is to say. Now we could develop our notion of person or same person or Pete or whatever more precisely to handle cases like that. And I think that's something we often do when we're confronted with cases like this or other cases, maybe that are more salient to everyday life. But as it turns out, this is one of the cases where it's not, we just haven't done so. Our concept has not been extended to handle this sort of case, to say that it's the same person or not the same person. And that's kind of, maybe this is appealing to you. Maybe, I think to a lot of people, this is maybe kind of radical. I don't know. What do you think broadly about this sort of approach?
I think I agree with it. I think that that's a really good diagnosis of what would lead us to this impasse. That the relevant concept is just open. There's not enough content to it, so we could stare at it, massage it all day long. No deduction is going to fall out that's going to settle one way or another whether you can survive a mind uploading. One thing I would add though is that sometimes there are these indeterminacies that get settled retroactively. I keep bringing up Dennett. I'm going to bring up Dennett again. Obviously, Dennett has had a big influence on me. So there's a remark that Dennett makes about he's focused on consciousness. We're not talking about that right now necessarily, but he says the question of when the lights come on, when does consciousness emerge? We should think of that as analogous to the question of when a species first exists. And if you really think about when a species first exists, there's really no way to know until after, much later, at some later point in time, you could go back and say, oh, that must have been the first chicken. Before that, it was just a proto-chicken, some pre-chicken, chickenoid, proto-chicken. But at the right, but that might be many generations later. You go back, you'll have enough evidence from about these early chickens that you could go back and say, oh, that was the point. Now, does that mean that back at that point in time, so let's just say it was January 1st, 2016. January 1st, 2016, no one was able to say that's when the first chicken was, We can only say it after the fact that, based on what later on happened, it must have been January 1st, 2016. Does that mean that at January 1st, 2016, when no one was in a position to possibly know whether there was a chicken, there was just no fact of the matter, or there wasn't a chicken there? There's a sense in which, like, no, then it's not saying that we're projecting chickens onto the world with our minds. It's not magic. It's just as a matter of fact, you need a lot more facts before you can make the retrospective judgment stick that this is when it happened. Okay, so that's a setup for an analogy that applies to mind uploading. There might be certain things that go down that make us say retrospectively, those transhumanists, they were right. They were right. And part of the paper is me trying to imagine like what might go down. And there I'm just lifting a story off of Greg Egan in his book, Diaspora, which is a great book, one of my favorite philosophically inspired pieces of fiction. In the Diaspora story, you've got a bunch of these post-human creatures. Some of them they've uploaded, they're just living lives of pure software. Some of them weren't ever humans. They're pieces of software that have since come to be since the first set of uploadings took place. There's another group that are they're in robot bodies. The first group, they just live in a virtual computer reality. The second group value contact with the external physical world, and so they live their lives, even though in some sense they're software too, but they have robot bodies and they always are in their robot bodies. They don't like virtual reality. And there's this third group, which they have biological bodies. They still live on the planet Earth. They allow certain amounts of genetic mutation, but they don't like cybernetics. They don't like computers. They don't like people uploading themselves into databases or robot bodies. And then there's this big conflict because this big disaster is coming. There's like a wave of harmful radiation headed towards the original home of humans. And some uploads and some robots go and offer them one more chance to upload and in some sense survive this catastrophe. And it's coming at such a high rate. There's no way they can load their biological bodies onto spaceships and fly them away. So the scenario was set up. So it's like, okay, this is your last chance. Some parts of the philosophical literature call this the burning ship scenario. So if you're on a burning ship and you know you're going to die, but someone offers you mind uploading, would you choose mind uploading? And you might say, well, I mean, like in this one case, I just stay on the ship, no mind uploading, I'm going to die. Then there's this other thing that maybe it's still death, but it might in some sense be survival. So some people argue that there's some basis for preferring mind uploading in a burning ship type of scenario. And we can see the Egan story as a kind of a burning ship scenario. And even in that scenario, all of the biological humans still reject mind uploading. Or maybe there's one exception, or I forgot now about the exception. But most of humanity that originally was just decided it wanted to stay on the planet Earth, they stay on the planet Earth and they're all incinerated. And so part of what gets eliminated with the death of all these biologically based humans is the very idea or the very value of valuing biological existence. So in the story, the debate between these different post-humans is settled in this non-rational way. One of them, they just went extinct because of their beliefs. And the others, they lived on by whatever we mean by lived on. In some sense, they lived on. We could define their belief as just a kind of an abstract pattern, and the abstract pattern continues to be instantiated. And so we could say that there's a kind of Darwinian value that attaches to believing that you could survive a mind upload. People that believe that they'll survive a mind upload are more likely to be mind uploaded. They're more likely to have multiple copies of themselves backed up on Jupiter and some on Mars. And so if there is some kind of catastrophe that wipes out the planet Earth, those people's beliefs are more likely to continue to be instantiated in the universe. Where people that are skittish about mind uploading, really don't have faith that they would survive it, they're more likely to go extinct, and their value system would be wiped out. Now, depending on what you mean by rationality, you could say this is irrational. It's just irrational. You just have to make a leap of faith, and maybe, it's kind of like Pascal's wager thing. You could say like your chances of survival, in some sense of survival, are slightly better chances, and if you, but in the sense of rational, where there's like a deductive proof that yes, you will survive, or no, you can't survive. No, there's no rational way out of this stalemate. As I see it, we're presented with a choice, and the choice is essentially an aesthetic choice or an ethical choice or something like that. It's a choice about what we value. Do you value viewing yourself and humans in general as the sort of things that couldn't survive mind uploading? Or do you value being the sorts of things that believe of themselves that they could survive mind uploading? And then from there, I think in one sense of rational, it's rationally accessible, the superiority, or at least someone wouldn't be irrational for choosing the one over the other. So someone might say like, you know what, I just prefer this kind of like old fashioned view of humans. And to be honest with you, that's really where I'm at these days. Like I'm probably not going to be a post-human. The idea of having my brain destructively scanned and then just living forever in virtual reality, and the risk of just like my existence being completely like taken over by the Disney Corporation, or I just become a property of Amazon. Like it's just so many layers of icky and gross. I'm probably just going to stay on the planet Earth and be incinerated with the rest of the organic humans from Egan's story. But nonetheless, someone might say like, look, I care about survival. I care about in some sense, like some aspect of humanity living on. I value that. And if we don't allow ourselves to upload, then everything human will go extinct. And probably much sooner. Like eventually the sun is going to expand and swallow the earth, and probably before that, there's going to be it just doesn't look good. Even if we make it to the heat death of the universe, there's still the heat death of the universe to worry about. But like, if you go with the mind upload creatures or entities or whatever you call that, it seems like your chances are better for something worth calling human or human-ish to survive much longer. You've got a better chance of making it to other parts of the galaxy. If you become an upload, there's a lot of, it's easier to transport yourself at near light speeds. You could just reduce your mass quite a bit by giving up the biological body. You don't need atmosphere once you've given up the biological body. You don't need food, a fusion reactor, and some CPU cycles, and you're good to go. And you could get a very small profile that can be cheaply transported. You could make it to all sorts of different parts of the galaxy. In some sense of rational, someone could rationally prefer that and align themselves with the transhumanists and the posthumanists. And the people that don't, like, in all honesty, myself, I just, as I get older, I just feel more sentimental and old fashioned, and I just want to, have a nice human life with my nice human family. And once we're all dead, like, at least it was good while it lasted.
Yeah, I can somewhat sympathize with that. I see some motivations either way, but yeah, there's really a lot of interesting stuff there, and more to talk about on that paper and a couple other papers that I read that I haven't had a chance to get to. But we're pretty much out of time, so if that's fine with you, I just want to do one kind of closing question.
Sure.
Question, yeah. And we can finish out.
Yeah,
it's been really great. I'll add first.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it too. But yeah, I've got a few more minutes. So that's fine.
Yeah. So Yeah, I like to end with a question about, what do you think the value of philosophy is? Why do you think philosophy is worth doing for you, I guess, but also for society or intellectually? I mean, yeah, what would you say about that?
I think of that as two separate questions. One of them is much more difficult than the other. What I think of as the value of philosophy, I think of it as like one of the like intrinsic goods. Um, my decision early in my life to be a philosopher or go into philosophy was really made in a frame of mind where I was trying to think of like, well, what is the best life? And um, lots of rich people have complained about how much it sucks being rich, and lots of famous people have complained about how much it sucks being famous. And we've got a lot of information from other people in other eras, and it seemed to me like a good life would be one in which you could be like free of those concerns and live a life of the mind and exploring big interesting topics. To me, that is a good. I get so much joy from it. It's not just pleasure, it's joy. And as someone who's also a teacher, I see at least some of my students have that same joy, and it just feels so good to know that I helped them get to that. So the question of like what the value of philosophy is for me is like, the answer is it's just intrinsically it's intrinsically good. And if you can't see that, well, I don't know what to tell you. It's kind of like, if someone, like, how would you convince someone to learn language? They don't know a language yet. Like, you're trying to argue with this newborn baby like why they should learn English or German or something. Learn a language. I mean, they're not going to understand any argument you could give until they first learn the language. And I think in a lot of ways philosophy is like that too. If you're not capable of doing it, you're not capable of understanding any argument for why you should do it. You do it, and you feel the joy, and you feel the happiness. But the other question, like, what's the value to society? That's a really tough question, and many of us that are educators are really wrestling that with that in a huge way. As more and more institutions of higher education are dependent on tuition, less and less public or state support for higher education. More and more educators have to like make their case to corporate interests. We have to like put everything in terms of how it's going to help capitalism. How is it going to help you become a cog in the capitalist machine? And maybe a good answer to that question is, don't be a cog in the capitalist machine. Yes, I understand you might need a job, but like, there's more to life than that. Um, but how do you convince uh, someone in the state legislature to you know put more funding into higher, like, that's not going to be a very convincing argument to them to say like, well, it's intrinsically good, or it's like one of the greatest things in life. It's you know that's a really hard sell. I do think that it's true that people that are acquire certain skills we recognize as being part of the philosophical package are in a better position to do things like get into law school. They're in a better position to just be writers and or do jobs that involve reading. A lot of philosophical training and skill makes you good at taking on management positions where you might be asked to just solve problems in a general sort of way, to be a troubleshooter across multiple domains, to be able to switch careers more rapidly. More and more, that's a thing. People might switch jobs many, many times during their, pre-retirement stage of their life. And philosophy majors have skills that better position them. But those are very difficult arguments to convince anybody of. And we're in the middle of this huge crisis in higher education, uh, because there's fewer and fewer students going into college from high school, in part because there's fewer people. There was this baby bust in 2008, and because of the recession, people were too bummed out to make babies, and now that cohort is coming out of high school and going into the colleges, and is just so much smaller than it was, say, 20 years ago. And higher education all over the place is just feeling that crunch. And so there's this mad dash for funding, and this big problem of how to justify philosophy to the rest of culture. And I really worry that like the most like the so-called highest levels of philosophy have really like cut themselves off from the masses. This is why I think projects such as yours, or philosophy podcasting in general, public philosophy, is just so important, because I think the culture needs to be reminded of what is good about philosophy, what's fun about it, what's interesting about it. And I think we've done ourselves a real disservice insofar as like we've presented academic philosophy as the only way of doing philosophy, and that only if you publish in these journals are you really a good philosopher. It doesn't count unless you're achieved this level of academic success. I think there's a danger of like we've really hurt ourselves as a community, the broadest sense of philosophers. We really hurt ourselves by like making that be the model of philosophical success. Like I think we need to really think about like what's going to track in the culture. What are people interested in that don't have a plan to get a PhD and become an academic or a professor, that are so I think it's up to philosophical creators to think of ways of just making it cool. And I don't think it's going to be an argument. I think it's going to be like, hey, check this out. Why are there certain musical genres or literate, like why are there certain books or movies or whatever that are popular, that hit it off? Well, it's not because anyone was convinced of an argument. Like no one said like, look, you have to like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and here's a 12-step proof of what you have to like about it. It was just like it took off. People marketed it in certain ways and showed what was entertaining or attractive about it. And I think that's how philosophers have to think about it. If we care about philosophy surviving, we need to just show that it's cool. We need to show ourselves having fun in a way that is accessible to people that don't have PhDs in it. But that's what I think the value of philosophy is. It's like there's something really joyous about being able to understand things in a way that's big ideas, seeing how it all hangs together. That's joyful. And I don't think there's any way of arguing for that. You just have to show it. You enculturate people into it. But you can't argue for it any more than you could convince a non-language user that they should use language.
Yeah, I like that. I like that way of putting a lot of great insights there. So, yeah. So I think we'll wrap up the questions there. It's been really great. Thanks so much for staying so long to take my questions and provide your some responses. It's been excellent.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed the discussion. I think you asked great questions, and I'm always happy to talk about that stuff.